Welcome back to Seek Before Sleep. Somewhere inside every single cell in your body, there's a secret, a molecular whisper from nearly 1,000,000 years ago that scientists only learned to read a couple of years ago. And what it says is terrifying. At some point, around 1.2 million years ago, the ancestors of every human alive today, every person who has ever walked this earth in the last 100,000 years, may have been reduced to a breeding population so small you could fit them all inside a single apartment complex. Not a city, not a town, an apartment complex. Now, here's what makes this one of the most haunting puzzles in all of science. We have the genetic fingerprint of that collapse. It's sitting right there in our chromosomes, like a scar that never fully healed. But we don't actually know what caused it. After years of analysis, mountains of data, and some of the most sophisticated computational tools ever aimed at ancient DNA, scientists can tell us that it happened. They can tell us roughly when. They can even tell us how few people were left. What they cannot tell us is why. That's the mystery. A species already scattered across landscapes, already adapted to dozens of different environments, already resourceful enough to have survived ice ages and droughts, nearly blinks out of existence. And the cause is still being argued about in journals and conference rooms right now. Was it climate? The planet was doing something genuinely violent around that period, shifting its entire rhythmic pattern of glacial cycles in ways that would have shredded ecosystems across Africa and beyond. Was it disease, something invisible and catastrophic spreading through already stressed populations? Was it a volcano, or several? A series of catastrophic eruptions capable of blocking sunlight for years and collapsing food chains from the ground up? Was it something more subtle, a gradual tightening of migration corridors, populations slowly cut off from each other, shrinking into dead ends with no way out? Maybe it was all of these things at once, a perfect storm hitting a species that simply had nowhere left to run. Over the next sections, we're going to dig into every one of those suspects. We're going to look at what the climate was actually doing, what the land looked like, where the animals went, where the people might have been, and why some of them made it, while almost everyone else didn't. But before we go there, I want to be clear about something. Genetics is extraordinary. It can reach back across nearly 1,000,000 years and detect the shadow of a near extinction. What it can't do is hand us a confession. Everything we explore from here is built on evidence, inference, and honest scientific debate. Some of this is well-supported theory. Some of it is still genuinely open. Also, quick pause. I'm genuinely curious where in the world you're listening to this right now. Drop a comment. Tell me your city and what time it is there, because every time I check, it's simultaneously midnight in Tokyo and Tuesday morning in São Paulo. That never stops being wild to me. All right, let's go find out what almost ended us. So, when scientists say 1,280 people, what does that actually mean? Because it doesn't mean what most headlines make it sound like. That number isn't a census. Nobody was counting. There were no campfire roll calls, no Stone Age population surveys. What geneticists calculated is something called the effective population size, and that distinction matters enormously. Effective population size is not the total number of humans alive. It's the number of individuals who are actually contributing genes to future generations in a meaningful, sustained way. Think of it like this. Imagine a village of 1,000 people, but only 100 of them are having children, and those children are surviving long enough to have children of their own. For the purposes of genetic inheritance, the rest of the village might as well not exist. The effective population is that 100, not the 1,000. Now scale that logic back across hundreds of thousands of years of scattered, stressed, semi-isolated human groups, and you start to see why 1,280 is a floor measurement, not a head count. The actual number of living humans during the bottleneck was almost certainly higher, maybe significantly higher, but the genetic diversity passing forward through time was equivalent to what you slided to aid. A small group of humans from a founding population of roughly 1,280 breeding individuals. Here's where it gets more complicated. Genetic bottlenecks don't all look the same. A sudden catastrophic crash, something that kills most of a population in a geological eye-link, leaves a very specific signature. You see a sharp reduction in diversity happening fast, almost like a wall in the data. But what the genetic analysis of this particular bottleneck suggests is something different, something more like a slow squeeze, a sustained compression of diversity lasting tens of thousands of years. That's not a disaster movie. That's a slow-motion siege. During that kind of prolonged bottleneck, a phenomenon called genetic drift takes over. When populations are small, random chance starts to dominate over natural selection. Rare gene variants disappear, not because they're bad, just because the people carrying them didn't happen to reproduce enough. Diversity bleeds away quietly, generation after generation, like air leaking from a tire. The longer the bottleneck holds, the more genetic information is permanently lost, and rebuilding that diversity afterward is extraordinarily slow work, measured in hundreds of thousands of years, not generations. Now, about that 1.22 million year figure, genetics gives us windows, not timestamps. The models that produce this estimate carry significant uncertainty ranges. Scientists broadly agree something happened, broadly agree it was severe, broadly agree it lasted an unusually long time. What they debate is the precise timing, the exact depth of the crash, and whether the signal reflects one event or several overlapping pressures compressing the population across different regions at different times. The reason 1,280 became a headline is because it's specific enough to feel real. It translates an abstract statistical concept into something human scaled. And that's actually useful, because what it's really telling you is this. At one point, the entire genetic future of humanity was balanced on a knife's edge, so narrow that a handful of additional deaths could have ended everything. That's not a rounding error. That's the whole story. So, how do scientists actually see something like this? How do you look at a living person's DNA and read a population crash that happened over 1 million years ago? The answer is that you don't find it directly, you infer it. And the tools used to do that inferring are some of the most sophisticated and most debated in all of science. The primary instrument is something called a coalescent model. Here's the basic logic. Every piece of DNA in your body has a history. If you trace any particular stretch of genetic code backward through your ancestors, and I trace the same stretch backward through mine, eventually those two lineages converge on a single common ancestor, a single person whose DNA gave rise to both versions. Geneticists call that convergence point a coalescent. Now, in a large, healthy population, coalescent events are spread out over long stretches of time. Lots of lineages, lots of branches, all diverging gradually. But in a small population, lineages don't have room to spread out. They pile up. Coalescent events happen faster, closer together in time, because there simply aren't that many people to carry distinct versions of any given gene. When geneticists look at modern human genomes and find that many lineages seem to converge suspiciously close together in time, clustering around the same deep window in prehistory. That clustering is the fingerprint of a bottleneck. But to translate that clustering into actual years, you need a clock. Two clocks, actually. The first is the mutation rate. DNA accumulates copying errors at a roughly predictable pace, like a molecular metronome ticking through generations. Count the mutations, divide by the rate, and you get a time estimate. The second clock is generation time, roughly how many years pass between a parent and their child. For ancient humans, scientists typically estimate somewhere around 25 to 30 years per generation. Though this is itself a source of debate, different assumptions about generation time can shift your dates by hundreds of thousands of years. These aren't flaws in the science exactly. They're just the rulers being used to measure deep history, and like any ruler, they have margins of error built in. Then there's recombination. Every time chromosomes are shuffled during reproduction, long stretches of DNA get broken up and mixed. Over enough generations, neighboring sections of a chromosome that were once inherited together start to separate. The longer a population has been large and diverse, the more thoroughly shuffled those chromosomes become. But if a population was very small for a very long time, shuffling slows down. You end up with unusually long, unbroken stretches of DNA that look identical across unrelated individuals because they all descend from the same tiny founding group. Geneticists call these long shared segments, and their length tells you roughly how old the bottleneck was. Longer segments mean a more recent compression. Shorter broken up segments mean the bottleneck was older, giving recombination more time to chip away at those shared blocks. What the 2023 study that produced the 1,280 figure found was a pattern consistent with a prolonged period of extremely low diversity, with shared segments pointing to a compression beginning around 1.2 million years ago and persisting for over 100,000 years. Not a spike, a plateau, a long grinding epoch of genetic poverty. But here's where honest scientists will tell you to slow down. These models come with real uncertainties, and some of them are significant. The first is sampling bias. Most of the genetic data used to reconstruct deep human history comes from a relatively small set of modern populations skewed heavily toward people of European and East Asian descent. The genetic landscape of ancient Africa, where human diversity is deepest and oldest, is still dramatically underrepresented in the datasets. What looks like a global bottleneck in the models might partly reflect gaps in who-wheeled gaps, actually sequenced. The second problem is population structure. The coalescent models work most cleanly when you assume a single, well-mixed population. But real prehistoric humans weren't one pool of randomly mating individuals. There were clusters, bands, regional groups, with varying degrees of isolation and contact. Population structure can mimic the signature of a bottleneck even when no catastrophic crash occurred. If you have several semi-isolated groups that rarely exchange genes, the diversity within any single lineage can look artificially low, not because the total population was tiny, but because information wasn't flowing freely between groups. Disentangling a genuine crash from the noise of population structure is genuinely hard, and different modeling approaches give different answers. The third uncertainty is model sensitivity. These simulations are built on assumptions, and when you change the assumptions, the conclusions shift. The 1,280 figure is not a measurement, it's the output of a model, and models are only as good as the inputs you feed them. This is where fossils and archaeology become important, not as confirmation exactly, but as a completely different kind of evidence, with completely different blind spots. The fossil record from this period is sparse and fragmentary. Bones don't preserve well across 1 million years, and the regions where early humans might have sheltered during a crisis, wet forested refugia in equatorial Africa, are exactly the places where fossilization is least likely. What fossils do exist show a real gap. Human remains from Africa become scarce precisely during the window the genetics flags as critical. That absence isn't proof of a bottleneck. Absence of evidence never is, but it's consistent with one. The archaeological record tells a similar story of discontinuity. Tool traditions that were widespread seem to contract or disappear during this period. Sites that show regular occupation go quiet. The world that re-emerges on the other side of the bottleneck looks subtly different from the one that went in. Genetics, fossils, archaeology. 3 kinds of evidence, 3 sets of limitations, 3 partial views of the same dark window in our past. None of them is complete. But when they all point roughly in the same direction, that's when scientists start to take the signal seriously. To make sense of any of this, we have to meet the people who were actually alive when this supposed dark crash happened, because they were not us. At 1.22 million years ago, you're in the middle of what paleoanthropologists call the early to middle Pleistocene, right on the doorstep of a major climatic upheaval. The stars of the show, as far as we can tell from the fossils, are not Homo sapiens. They're earlier humans, usually grouped under names like Homo erectus, Homo aster, and a cluster of closely related lineages that blur into each other more than our tidy species labels would like to admit. If you could stand in front of one of them, you'd recognize them as human instantly, not an ape, not a chimp. Their bodies, from the neck down, would look startlingly familiar. Long legs, relatively short arms, narrow hips compared to great apes, a ribcage that doesn't flare out dramatically. Average height somewhere in the neighborhood of a smaller modern adult, maybe 5 to 5.5 feet, with a build tuned for endurance more than brute force. But from the neck up, especially the skull, the differences hit you. Thick brow ridges like a built-in visor, a long, low brain case, not the high rounded dome you see if you look in a mirror. Brain size somewhere around 2/3 to 3/4, that of modern humans. Still big compared to other animals, but not quite at our level. The face would project forward more. The chin, that little bony ledge modern humans are so proud of, basically not there. These are the humans walking into the bottleneck. When geneticists say humanity shrank to 1,280 people, this is who they're talking about. Populations that belong to our broader human lineage, but existed hundreds of thousands of years before anything we'd call Homo sapiens appeared. That distinction matters. We're not looking back at a near extinction of modern humans. We're looking at a crisis that hit the trunk of the family tree before it split into the branches that would later lead to Neanderthals, Denisovans, and us. So, what do we actually know about how these people lived? The bones and the stone tools paint a picture of a species built for movement. Homo erectus is sometimes called the first obligate long-distance walker and runner. Earlier humans, like Homo habilis, still had some tree-climbing features in their shoulders and hands. Erectus and its African relatives, like Homo arstaster, are mostly done with that. Their feet, ankles, knees, and spines are committing to a life on the ground. That commitment comes with a lifestyle, high mobility, big home ranges, and the ability to cover serious distances to find food and water. You don't get that kind of skeleton if you're just puttering around a forest patch. You get it if you're following migrating herds, tracking shifting water holes, or scouting new territories when the old ones fail. Their diet matches that pattern. Tooth wear, isotopes in the enamel, and the cut marks on fossil animal bones all tell the same story. These people were omnivores with serious flexibility. They used stone tools to butcher animals, breaking long bones to get at the calorie-dense marrow. There's evidence of regular meat eating, not just the occasional scavenged carcass, but they weren't specialist carnivores. Plant remains where patterns on teeth and residue on tools suggest broad diets: roots, tubers, seeds, maybe nuts and fruits when available. In other words, they were generalists, not picky eaters, not locked into a single niche. When conditions changed, a group could, in principle, lean harder on meat, or on full-back plant foods, or on shellfish if they were near coasts or lakes. That kind of dietary flexibility is exactly what you'd want if you're about to be thrown into 100,000 years of climatic chaos. Their tools were still relatively simple by later standards, but revolutionary compared to what came before. This is the age of the Akalan hand axe. Tear-shaped stone tools carefully flaked on both sides, used for butchering, chopping wood, maybe even digging. To make these consistently, across generations and across continents, and you need more than brute strength. You need the ability to copy, to learn, and to teach. That implies social learning, perhaps rudimentary teaching, and some form of structured communication. So, you have a picture of a species that's physically capable, behaviorally flexible, technologically competent, and socially organized enough to pass on complex skills. This is the humanity that genetics is telling us nearly shrank to almost nothing. Now, zoom out. Where were these people? By 1.22 million years ago, fossils and tools put Homo erectus and its relatives across a huge geographic range. In Africa, we see them from South Africa up through East Africa and into the north. Sites in Kenya, Ethiopia, Tanzania, South Africa, all hold remains from roughly this time frame or a bit earlier. Fossils, like the famous Nariotomy boy from Kenya, just under 2 million years old, show that by the time of the bottleneck, this basic body plan had been around for a while. Outside Africa, Homo erectus had already done something no earlier human had managed. They had left stone tools and bones in Georgia. At Dimoni in the Caucasus show hominins outside Africa by about 1.8 million years ago. In Indonesia, Homo erectus appears by around 1.45 million years ago. In China, sites like Zakudian near Beijing preserve evidence of their presence in East Asia. Across this whole band, from the African Savas, through the Levant into Eurasia, and down to Ireland, Southeast Asia, members of the same broad human lineage are turning up. That spread is important for two opposing reasons. On one hand, geographic spread should make you safer. If climate collapses local ecosystem in East Africa, populations in Indonesia or Georgia don't necessarily feel it the same way. If a drought wipes out a particular river valley, groups hundreds or thousands of miles away may be unaffected. In a sense, humanity had already bought an insurance policy against purely local disasters, just by being dispersed. On the other hand, a wide distribution also means a wide exposure. The Plein world is swinging between colder and warmer phases. Ice sheets are expanding and retreating. Rainfall belts are marching north and south. If big-scale climate patterns shift, they can hit multiple regions at once. The very fact that early humans had pushed out of Africa into temperate and even colder zones left some of them living right at the edge of what their bodies and technologies could handle. A downturn in temperatures, a collapse in prey populations, a shift in vegetation zones, And suddenly those frontier populations become incredibly vulnerable. And this is where the word humanity gets slippery. When geneticists say the effective population size dropped to around 1,280, they don't mean there were exactly 1,280 Homo erectus individuals alive on the entire planet, neatly counted. They mean that from the perspective of the genes that make it into later humans, it's as if only about 1,280 breeding individuals made it through that window. Some of those might have been in Africa, some might have been in Eurasia, or it might be that only certain regional populations actually contributed to later lineages, while others withered without leaving descendants that survived to the present. The fossils don't tell us that part. The DNA only tells us that the lineages that eventually lead to us, Neanderthals and Denisovans, pass through something like that narrow gate. To make it even messier, our fossil record is essentially a series of pinpricks on a giant, mostly dark map. We know a handful of sites, a skull here, a jaw there, a scattering of stone tools in a layer of ancient river sediment. We know Homo erectus reached Java. We know they were in northern China. We know they were in parts of East and South Africa. But what about the enormous spaces in between? Were there continuous populations stretching across broad regions, exchanging mates and ideas over long distances? Or were they broken up into many small semi-isolated groups, separated by deserts, mountains, dense forests, or just stretches of land too risky to cross under certain climates? We don't know how many groups existed. We don't know how often they bumped into each other. We don't know how many times a small band died out in one valley, only to be replaced centuries later by migrants from somewhere else. Every Aeolian hand axe we find is probably the tiniest fragment of a much larger story of movement, contact, and disappearance. We also don't know exactly where the people who matter for our story were living during the bottleneck itself. The genetic signal says something drastic happened and only a limited set of lineages made it through. The fossils say Africa and parts of Eurasia hosted humans before and after that time, but the record right in the middle goes strangely quiet, especially in Africa. Between one fossil horizon and the next, tens or hundreds of thousands of years can pass. Entire populations can rise, move, split, merge, and vanish without leaving a single bone in a place we've actually dug. The gaps in our map might be where the crucial refuges were, corridors of stable climate, patches of persistent water, coastal zones or river systems where tiny populations of early humans hung on while the rest of the world turned hostile. So when we say humanity shrank, we're talking about these scattered, mobile, tough, but not invincible bands of homoctus-like people spread thinly across a volatile planet. They're already explorers. They're already tool-makers. They're already big-brain generalists, juggling meat and plants, fire and stone. They're also, from our vantage point, almost invisible. We can outline their bodies from a few skeletons, sketch their tools from eroded stone, infer their diets from microscopic scratches on teeth. But how many of them there were, how tightly they were connected, where the critical survivors actually huddled when the world turned against them, those are precisely the pieces we're still missing. To find those answers, we have to stop looking only at the people and start looking harder at the stage they were standing on. Because around 1.2 million years ago, that stage was beginning to shift under their feet in ways no human had ever experienced before. When we talk about the stage shifting, we're not talking about a gentle costume change. We're talking about a planet that on geological timescales started having violent mood swings. Go back a few million years before our bottleneck. The Earth is already in an ice age in the broad sense. Polar ice caps, cooler global temperatures compared to the deep past. But the rhythm is different. Climate swings in and out of colder phases on a roughly 41,000-year cycle, tied closely to predictable tilts in the Earth's axis. Ice sheets grow and shrink, but they're smaller. Sea levels rise and fall, but not as dramatically. Rainfall belts shift, but slowly enough that ecosystems and the animals in them can shuffle around and keep up. By the time our early humans are walking around at 1-2 million years ago, that rhythm is changing. The overall trend is downward. Cooler average temperatures, more ice locked up at the poles, longer periods where the planet is in a glacial state, and shorter, sharper, warm interludes in between. On top of that, something else is happening that really matters for creatures living by their wits on the ground. The swings themselves are getting more chaotic. Ice cores from Antarctica and Greenland, deep-sea sediment cores from the ocean floor, and ancient shorelines carved into rock all tell the same story. The climate isn't just moving between cold and warm. It's overshooting, undershooting, stalling, lurching. Glacial interglacial cycles that used to be relatively smooth start to show sudden jumps, abrupt reversals, odd double peaks. This instability shows up everywhere that matters to a hunter-gatherer. When huge ice sheets in the northern hemisphere expand, they suck water out of the oceans. Sea levels drop, sometimes by more than 100 meters. Coastlines march outward, exposing broad continental shelves. Shallow bays where your ancestors might have collected shellfish turn into wide, flat plains. River mouths move, estuaries drain or shift, and the rich, productive edge zones where land and sea meet are ripped away or relocated. When the glaciers retreat, the process reverses. Meltwater floods back into the oceans. Sea levels rise. Those exposed shelves drown again. Low-lying river valleys become estuaries or deep bays. Any group of humans that had come to rely on those newly exposed lands finds their entire resource base slowly sinking beneath them over a few thousand years. Now add rainfall to that picture, the belts of rain that encircle the planet. The tropical monsoons, the storm tracks of the mid-latitudes, don't stay put. They slide north and south as the planet warms and cools, following shifts in temperature gradients between equator and poles. In a warmer phase, you might have a broad, lush band of grasslands across part of Africa, rivers that run year-round, lakes that filter their rims. In a cooler or differently configured phase, that same region might turn into arid savanna, patchy scrubland, or outright desert. This isn't a one-time event. It's a dance that repeats over and over, with different regions gaining and losing water. Rivers that were dependable become seasonal. Lakes that had been there for hundreds of generations shrink, split into smaller basins, or vanish completely. Springs dry up. Groundwater tables drop. The places where animals gather to drink move, and the humans who follow those animals are forced to move with them. Grasslands, the heart of Homo erectus country, are especially sensitive. They depend on a fairly precise balance of rainfall and temperature. Shift that balance, and the grasslands can collapse into dry, nearly barren landscapes, or close up into woodland and forest. For a species built for long-distance movement in open terrain, both of those transitions present problems. Too little vegetation, and there's nothing to eat, nothing to support the herds you hunt. Too much dense cover, and the visibility and travel speed that your long legs evolved for become less useful. So you have a world where ice, seas, rivers, rainbelts, and vegetation zones are all shifting around on timescales that matter to your survival. Not overnight, but often within the span of a few hundred or a few thousand years. That's long enough that the land your great-grandparents knew can be unrecognizable to you, and short enough that evolution can't design an entirely new body plan in time to keep up. Culture and movement have to do most of the work. Here's the cruel twist. In this kind of world, variability can be deadlier than simple cold. If the planet just cooled a bit and stayed that way for 1,000,000 years, ecosystems would settle into a new pattern. Animals would shift their ranges, plants would redistribute, and highly mobile generalist humans like Homo erectus could track those changes. There would be winners and losers, but at least the rules would be stable. But that's not the game they were in. They were playing climate roulette. One generation might grow up in a relatively wet phase with rivers flowing, lakes broad and deep, and grasslands teeming with grazing animals. Your group might expand, have more children, spread out into new territories. Then, over a few centuries, within the memory of elders who are still alive, the rains fail more often, the wet seasons shorten, dry seasons lengthen, herds thin out or migrate away. Plants you relied on as fallback foods become scarce or disappear. Your band doesn't instantly die. You compress into the best remaining patches. You walk farther to get water. You increase your reliance on marginal foods, tough roots, bitter seeds, anything you can process with stone tools and fire to wrest calories from. Maybe you start ranging into territories used by neighboring groups, and now you have conflict on top of scarcity. If that dry phase lasts long enough, some local populations will simply vanish, not in a spectacular apocalyptic event, but through slow attrition, lower birth rates, higher infant mortality, more deaths from disease and injury. When bodies are already undernourished, a few bad decades can be enough to push a small band over the edge. Then, just as your region is emptied out or hanging on by a thread, the climate snaps back. Rainfall patterns shift again. The place that almost killed you starts to green up. New grass, returning herds, refilling waterholes. For a while, the land can support more people than there are actually left to use it. This resource whiplash is brutal for population stability. Expansion in good decades, contraction or local extinction in bad ones. Repeat that process across the patchwork of Africa, the Levant, Eurasia, and you don't get one smooth human population. You get a mosaic of groups constantly forming, growing, splitting, and blinking out. Under these conditions, the difference between extinction and survival often comes down to geography and luck. Even in harsh phases, not everywhere is equally bad. Some landscapes are buffered against the full force of climate swings. These are the refugia, pockets of relative stability where water, game, and edible plants persist even when the surrounding regions go dry or freeze. A refugium might be a deep rift valley with its own microclimate, where rivers are fed by springs instead of just rainfall. It might be a coastal strip where upwelling currents in the ocean keep marine life productive even as the interior dries. It could be a mountain region where elevation gradients mean that as one band of vegetation fails, another band upslope or downslope becomes viable. We see hints of these refuges in the geological and fossil records. Lakes that stayed wet when others dried. River systems that seem to have flowed continuously across multiple climate cycles. Patches of forest or woodland that receded surrounding areas after dry phases ended. In some of these places, we also find stone tools or hominin fossils appearing again across long spans of time. For early humans, these refugia would have been literal lifeboats. When the wider landscape became a patchwork of near uninhabitable zones, the valleys with water, the coasts with shellfish, the mountains with persistent springs would be where small groups could huddle, ride out bad millennia, and then expand when conditions improved. But living in scattered refuges comes with a genetic price. Think about gene flow, the movement of genes through a population via mating. When the world is relatively stable, bands of humans can range widely, bump into each other, exchange mates, and keep the overall gene pool mixed. You can walk across a continent over generations and still be part of one big, interconnected population. In a world chopped up by expanding deserts, flooded lands, and shifting vegetation belts, that connectivity breaks down. Refugia that once had continuous corridors between them become isolated islands of habitability. The routes you used to walk are now too dry to cross without dying, or too thickly forested, and dangerous or cut off by new water barriers. You still move a lot within your refuge, but your chances of meeting another band from a distant refuge drop dramatically. Populations fragment. A few hundred individuals in one lake basin, a few dozen families along a particular stretch of coast, another cluster tucked into a mountain valley, each one hanging on but largely breeding within itself, with only occasional trickles of new genes arriving when a brave or desperate group manages to cross the bad lands in between. From a genetic perspective, that's exactly the scenario that drives down effective population size. You don't need every Homo erectus on Earth to die in some single catastrophe. You just need most of them to end up in isolated, fluctuating pockets where repeated local collapses wipe out whole lineages, and where the survivors are drawn from a shrinking, increasingly inbred set of groups. Over hundreds of thousands of years, as the planet's climate keeps jerking from one state to another, those pockets become the entire story. Some refugia wink out when their water sources fail. Others stay viable longer and send out migrants when the world briefly becomes more forgiving. But the overall pattern is one of fragmentation and reconnection over and over. By the time genetics tells us that humanity has been squeezed down to an effective size of about 1,280 individuals, it's against this background. A planet that refuses to sit still, where ice and oceans and rain and grass are constantly rearranging the board. Our ancestors weren't just small in number because something killed them. They were small because the world was repeatedly cutting their connections, shattering their range into isolated refuges, and forcing evolution to play out in tiny, vulnerable groups. And the really unsettling part is the worst of that climatic chaos was only just getting underway. Geologists have a name for this whole ramp-up in chaos. They call it the Mid-Pleistocene Transition, or MPT. It's not just a label. It marks the moment the planet's ice age heartbeat changed. Before the MPT, as we saw, Earth's climate tended to pulse on a roughly 41,000-year cycle, mostly driven by changes in the tilt of the planet's axis. Tilt more, you get stronger seasons, ice retreats. Tilt less, seasons weaken, ice advances. The ice sheets waxed and waned, but they were comparatively modest, and the cold phases were relatively short. Then, somewhere between about 1.52 million and 700,000 years ago, that rhythm broke. The climate record, those deep-sea sediments, Antarctic ice bubbles, ancient shorelines, starts to show something new. The cycles stretch. Instead of glaciations coming and going every 41,000 years, the big swings begin to line up with a 100,000-year rhythm, tied more to the shape of Earth's orbit than to its tilt. And those glacial phases don't just get longer, they get nastier. Ice sheets grow thicker and extend farther south. Sea levels fall more. Global temperatures drop lower. And crucially, they stay low for longer stretches of time. The warm interglacials between these long freezes, they become shorter, sharper spikes of relative comfort sandwiched between extended winters. Exactly why this happened is still debated. Some researchers argue that as the northern ice sheets gradually grew larger over millions of years, they reached a tipping point where their own weight and interaction with the bedrock and oceans changed how they responded to orbital forcing. Others point to slow changes in atmospheric CO2 or to feedbacks involving erosion, dust, and ocean circulation. The details are still being argued in conference halls and journal articles, but the pattern itself is not in doubt. From the perspective of a hominin trying to eat, the MPT is the moment when the game switches from frequent small punches to fewer, much harder hits. Longer, harsher glacials are bad news for big animals, and big animals were the backbone of early human diets. Think about a Pleistocene grassland before the MPT really bites. It's full of large herbivores, ancestral elephants, hippos, rhinos, giant bovids, horse-like equids. These animals are slow to reproduce. Many have long gestation periods, low numbers of offspring, and complex social structures. They're incredibly productive when times are good, turning grass into tons of meat, fat, and marrow. But their populations can't bounce back quickly from major shocks. Stretch a glacial out to tens of thousands of years. Drop temperatures, rearrange rainfall, and you start squeezing those megapora from multiple directions. Grasslands shrink or fragment. Forests advance in some areas, deserts in others. Permanent water sources dry up or become seasonal. Migration routes that worked for generations get cut off by ice, new rivers, dune fields, or dense woodland. Herds are forced into tighter corridors, competing more intensely for the remaining grazing and browse. Droughts bite harder when there are fewer alternative routes and refuges. When populations of large mammals fall below certain thresholds, they become vulnerable to what ecologists call demographic stochasticity, the bad luck of small numbers. A few bad years of calf survival, a disease outbreak, a run of harsh winters that kill off older breeders, and a local population can slide into collapse even without hunters on the scene. Now, add hunters. By 1.22 million years ago, hominins aren't just timid scavengers waiting for lions to finish. Cut marks on bones, stone tool assemblages, and the distribution of kill sites all suggest active hunting, at least of some prey, plus systematic marrow extraction, and maybe even early forms of meat drying or sing. Our ancestors are tied to these big mammals not just as occasional windfalls, but as a critical, high-value food source, especially during lean seasons. So when long glacials knock megafaunal populations down, human populations that depend on them get knocked down too. Fewer herds mean longer distances between kills, more competition with carnivores, more conflict with neighboring human groups over access to the best hunting grounds. Protein and fat shortages during key parts of the year hit fertility, infant survival, and immune resilience. This isn't a simple ice kills human story. It's a chain reaction. Change the glacial rhythm, and you change the vegetation. Change the vegetation, and you change the herbivores. Change the herbivores, and you change the hunters built around them. And the knock-on effects go deeper. Fire, for instance. Early humans didn't invent lightning, but they learned to take advantage of what it did. Natural fires sweep through dry grasslands and open woodlands, clearing old growth, recycling nutrients, and often promoting new flushes of grass and forbs. Many grazing animals are actually attracted to recently burned areas because of the tender regrowth. For hominins, that means fire-shaped landscapes can be good hunting grounds. Under MPT-style climates, fire regimes shift in some regions. Longer cold and dry phases may suppress vegetation enough that there simply isn't much to burn. Fires become rarer, patchier. In other places, decades of plant growth accumulate during cool, moist periods, only to go up in massive, intense fire events when conditions swing back toward dryness and wind. Instead of frequent, moderate burns that create a mosaic of habitats, you get more boom and bust, fire patterns that can erase whole patches of woodland or scrub in one go. Those big fires change soil properties, seed banks, and the structure of plant communities. They can transform a mixed landscape with lots of ecological niches into a more monotonous one, or vice versa, depending on timing and intensity. And that cascades into which animals can live there, which predators can exploit them, and whether a band of hominins can count on that area for food every year, or only in certain climate phases. Prey communities shift as well. Large bulk grazing species tend to be more sensitive to long, harsh bottlenecks than smaller, flexible animals. As the MPT grinds on, you see in various regions a pattern of megafaunal turnover. Some big species disappear or retreat to restricted ranges, while smaller, faster breeding, more generalist animals, antelopes, pigs, smaller deer, become more dominant. For hominins, that's a mixed blessing. Smaller prey are easier to hunt, but each kill yields less. You need more kills per year to feed the same number of mouths, which means more time spent hunting, more risk, and more chance of failure in a bad season. It also puts a premium on tools, coordination, and knowledge. Exactly the skills that our lineage will become famous for, but which may not have been fully developed yet in those early bottleneck ancestors. Take all these threads and weave them together over hundreds of thousands of years, and you start to see how the Mid-Pleistocene Transition could create the kind of genetic signal we see today. Genetic bottlenecks don't need a single cinematic disaster. They just need sustained, repeated stress that keeps effective population size low. Under the new 100,000-year climate rhythm, hominin populations are hit by extended glacials, far forces that last long enough to grind ecosystems down to a series of patchy refuges. Between those glacials, warmer interglacials open up new territory and allow expansions. But the expansions are starting from a small base, the few groups that manage to hang on in the worst phases, and they don't have forever. Another long cold phase arrives, another round of fragmentation, another culling of already small scattered bands. From a genetic standpoint, this can look less like a series of separate crashes and more like one long drawn-out narrowing. Lineages wink out during each glacial. Only a subset makes it through to seed the next expansion. Over time, the diversity lost in each cycle is not fully replaced. Mutations accumulate, but the deep, ancient variation from bigger, more stable populations in the earlier Pleistocene keeps being shaved away. When modern geneticists run their models backwards in time, the math compresses all those rises and falls, all those isolated refugees and failed lineages into a single effective bottleneck, an ancestral population that for a very long time behaved like it only contained about 1,280 breeding individuals. Could the Mid-Pleistocene Transition be the main driver of that? It's a compelling story, and there is some evidence that points in that direction. We know from marine cores and ice records that the major shift in glacial rhythm overlaps with the rough window of the inferred human bottleneck. We also see in the fossil record signs of fall turnover around this time, changes in the composition of mammal communities, extinctions of some large herbivores and carnivores, and the appearance of new forms. In some regions, hominin fossils themselves seem to thin out or change morphology across this boundary, suggesting population reductions, replacements, or both. There are hints, too, in the stone tool record. Some areas show gaps or simplifications in technology around the MPT, which could mean local extinctions or population replacements by groups with different traditions. Other regions show the persistence of certain tool styles across multiple climate cycles, hinting at refugial continuity, places where small groups might have survived while others vanished. But there are still big uncertainties. For one thing, our fossil record is patchy and biased. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Not finding hominin bones in a particular layer doesn't prove they weren't there. For another, linking specific climate phases to specific demographic events is tricky. The dating methods have error bars. The climate signals are global, while demographic responses are local and regional. And genetics, powerful as it is, collapses all the messy geography and ecology into a few summary statistics. An effective population size of 1,280 doesn't tell you how many real individuals were alive, or exactly where they lived, or how many times they nearly died out and then rebounded. It just tells you how much genetic diversity was being maintained on average over long stretches of time. So, the Mid-Pleistocene Transition is best seen as a stage setter, not a smoking gun. It created a world of longer winters and shorter reprieves of ecosystems running on a harsher boom and bust schedule. In that world, big mammals struggled, landscapes burned and regrew in new patterns, and hominin populations were repeatedly squeezed into small, isolated refugees. Whether that alone can explain a 117,000-year-long genetic bottleneck is still an open question. But if you'd seek, looking for a background condition that would make such a bottleneck not just possible, but likely, the MPT is hard to ignore, and it sets up the next piece of the puzzle. Where exactly those tiny pockets of survivable habitat were, and how they might have shaped the humans who hid there while the long winter raged outside. To answer that, we have to zoom in on Africa itself, because during the Mid-Pleistocene Transition, Africa isn't just sitting there as a static backdrop. It's breathing, expanding and contracting, wetting and drying, opening and slamming, shut the very pathways our ancestors needed to survive. Today, when people picture Ice Age, they imagine glaciers in Europe and North America, but the glaciers were only the visible teeth of the system. Far to the south, Africa was feeling the bite in a different way, through rain. African rainfall is tied to global climate engines, sea surface temperatures, monsoon systems, shifting wind belts. When the big northern ice sheets grow and global temperatures drop, those circulation patterns move. The equatorial rain belts sag or shift, monsoons weaken, and regions that were once green begin to dry. On long time scales, this creates what paleoclimatologists call African humid periods and dry phases. Swing after swing between landscapes laced with lakes and rivers and landscapes where those same basins are empty bowls of dust. During humid phases, huge parts of the continent become connected. North Africa, which today we know as the Sahara, doesn't just get a little rain, it transforms. Lake basins fill, some of them growing to the size of small seas. Rivers flow, where now there is only sand. Fossil shorelines and ancient river channels mapped from satellites and fieldwork tell us that the Sahara of these green phases was a giant savanna highway dotted with wetlands, gallery forests and grasslands. In East Africa, the rift valleys brim with water, lakes like Turkana, Victoria, and others. We don't even have modern names for expand, merge, and spill. River systems interlink, forming continuous corridors of water and vegetation that stretch for hundreds, even thousands of kilometers. For hominins, these are golden ages of movement. You can follow herds north, south, east, and west without crossing lethal deserts. You can move along lake shores and riverbanks with reliable access to water, fish, plant foods, and migratory game. Groups that were once isolated in separate basins can meet, mix, exchange mates, trade stone, share tools and stories. Genetically, humid phases are moments when diversity can spread. Mutations that appeared in one valley can over generations ripple out across the continent. Genes flow along the green corridors, but then the climate flips. As long glacials bite down, those same lakes shrink or vanish. Rivers become seasonal trickles or disappear entirely. The big green corridors that once stitched Africa together don't just get narrower, many of them break. Instead of one big connected savanna, you get a patchwork. Here, a highland region still catching stray rains from a deflected monsoon. There, a deep rift lake clinging to life because it's fed by groundwater and distant mountain runoff. Elsewhere, a coastal strip where upwelling oceans keep the air just moist enough for scrub and woodland to hang on when the inland plains have turned to dust. These become refugia refugees. The refugia hypothesis in this context is simple but powerful. During the worst climatic phases, most of Africa becomes extremely hard to live in for large, slow-breeding mammals and the hominins who hunt and gather around them. But a few pockets remain relatively stable and productive. Those pockets harbor refuge populations, small scattered bands who survive while others vanish. What does a refugium look like on the ground? Picture a long rift valley lake that doesn't dry up completely even in bad times. Its shrinking shoreline is still lined with reeds, fish, shellfish, and waterfowl. Behind it, steep escarpments catch orographic rain, feeding springs and patches of forest. Between the cliffs and the shore, there's a narrow belt of usable habitat, edible tubers, fruit trees, small antelope, maybe even remnant herds of larger grazers that crowd in as the surrounding plains fail. Or imagine a mountainous region in eastern or southern Africa. As lowlands turn to semi-desert, the higher slopes trap clouds. Montane forests and grasslands hold on. Streams run, even in the dry season. It's cooler, wetter, more buffered from the extremes. For hominins that can handle elevation and steeper terrain, these highlands become a last redoubt. Or consider a coastal refugium, a strip along the Indian Ocean or Atlantic where currents maintain a milder, more predictable climate. Even when inland rains falter, the coast offers shellfish, fish, seabirds, and plants adapted to salty, windy conditions. If you can harvest the shore, you don't have to rely entirely on inland game. Each of these refugia is both a lifeline and a trap. A lifeline because they concentrate what's left of the resources. If you can reach one and adapt to its particular challenges, your chances of surviving a long bad phase go way up. A trap because leaving becomes harder and harder as conditions around the refugium deteriorate. Venture too far from the lake, the mountain, the coast, and you hit empty country. Dry plains with no reliable water, no predictable food, vast stretches that might take you days to cross, with nothing but morasses to drink. In humid times, a river system is a highway. In hyper-arid times, that same valley is a walled canyon with a dead, salty puddle at the bottom. Its steep sides limit your movement laterally. Its dry bed offers no help going forward. If predators, disease, or rival human groups pressure you, you have nowhere easy to run. Rifts can do this too. When they're full, they connect basins, marking out predictable routes. When they contract into deep, steep-sided pools, they hem you in. The best remaining land is a narrow ring around the water. Everyone, humans, herbivores, carnivores, is forced into the same strip. Competition spikes, and a single drought year or disease outbreak can have outsized effects. From a continental perspective, imagine Africa during a particularly harsh glacial phase of the Mid-Pleistocene Transition. Instead of a continuous patchwork of good and bad habitats, you now have maybe a handful of serious holdouts. An Ethiopian highland refugium, an East African rift refugium, a Southern African coastal refugium, perhaps patches in Central or West Africa tied to persistent rainforest or uplands. Small human populations cling to each of these. They may number in the low thousands continent-wide, maybe fewer, but they're not sitting around a single lake. They're marooned in separate green islands in a brown sea. Now, think about what that does to genetics. If there was only one major African refugium for hominins during the worst phases, say a single broad region in East Africa that never became completely uninhabitable, then the genetic story is relatively simple. Everyone alive during those troughs is part of one interconnected metapopulation spread across local bands, but exchanging genes often enough that from the perspective of their DNA, they behave like a single, very small population. Diversity is pruned hard, and it stays pruned because there's nowhere else to hide. If instead there were multiple distinct refugia, Ethiopian highlands, East African lakes, southern coast, central rainforest edges, things get more complicated. In the short term, several refugees means more total hominins can survive, and each pocket can maintain its own little slice of diversity. Mutations can arise independently in different refugia. Cultural traditions, too, can diverge. One group might specialize in high-altitude foraging, another in littoral shellfish collecting, another in lake-edge hunting. But isolation cuts both ways. If those refugia stay separated for tens of thousands of years with little or no gene flow, some of those lineages will blink out entirely when local conditions finally fail, or when competition, disease, or sheer bad luck wipes them. From the genetic point of view, what matters is not just how many refugia there were, but how often they reconnect. A humid interlude that opens even a few migration corridors for a couple thousand years can both allow survivors from 2 or 3 refugia to mix, sharing their accumulated genetic baggage before the next dry phase slams the doors again. Over many such cycles, the long-term pattern that modern geneticists infer that persistent, effective population size of about 1,280 could emerge from a dance of splitting and merging refugial populations. One refugium gives you a simple, deep bottleneck. Several refugia give you a more braided story, parallel tiny lineages, diverging, some ending in dead ends, others rejoining. Ironically, both can leave a similar-looking genetic scar when you average over 117,000 brutal years. But multiple refugia also create more opportunities for local extinctions that never leave a trace in our DNA, because those lines never made it into the final mix. And this is where Africa's fossil record starts to tease and frustrate us. Between about 900,000 and 700,000 years ago, right when genetic models say the bottleneck is tightening, hominin fossils across much of Africa get sparse. There are hints, fragments, scattered finds, but there's no clear continuous record of thriving populations marching steadily through time. Does that mean humans almost vanished from the continent? Maybe. It fits the refugia model beautifully. Most regions become inhospitable. Only a few pockets hang on, and the odds of our finding the bones of a few hundred surviving individuals 900,000 years later are tiny. But it could also mean our sampling is bad. Erosion may have stripped out the right layers in some regions. Others may be buried under later sediments, forests, cities, or simply have never been excavated. Fossils only form under specific conditions, survive under others, and are discovered under an even narrower set. If you rely on the fossil record alone, whole populations can live, die, and leave almost nothing we'll ever see. So when we look at Africa in this window and see big geographic gaps, we have to be careful. Absence of fossils is not the same as absence of hominins. But when the genetic data, the climate reconstructions, and the patchiness of fossils all point in the same general direction towards fragmentation, towards isolation, towards survival in scattered favorable zones, the refugia picture starts to look less like speculation and more like a plausible framework. In that framework, the 1,280 ancestors are not standing together in one miraculous oasis. They're scattered across Africa's shifting map of lakes, valleys, coasts, and highlands. Corridors open, they move. Corridors close, they're trapped. Some groups vanish without a trace. Others hold on just long enough for the next wet phase to knit a few survivors back together. And while Africa's green and brown belts are breathing in and out, something else is happening further north in Eurasia, where expansion, isolation, and sudden dead ends will play out in an even more dramatic way. When we shift our gaze north into Eurasia, the story gets stranger, because long before that 1.2 million year bottleneck, hominins had already done something astonishing. They'd left Africa. We have stone tools and fossils in places like Diani in Georgia and sites in China and Java, telling us that by around 1.38 million years ago, early Homo, probably Homo erectus, and close relatives had pushed out of their African cradle and into entirely new worlds. Think about what that actually means. You're a tropical ape evolved in landscapes where frost is a rumor, where day length doesn't swing wildly, where food and water may be scarce, but at least the basic rhythm of the seasons is familiar. And then, over many generations, your descendants walk north. They enter the Caucasus, the Levant, Central Asia. Winters get colder, nights get longer. Summers get brutally hot and dry, or weirdly brief and wet. The plants are different, the animals are different, even the diseases are different, and yet they make it. The Dimi fossils show small-bodied, relatively simple humans. Not some hyper-advanced superspecies, but they were resourceful enough to hunt and scavenge in temperate forests and steppe to cope with frost, to manage fire, at least sometimes, to survive in places that no hominin had ever seen before. Those early dispersals into Eurasia are a giant neon sign flashing one word: adaptability. Our lineage was already capable of exploring wildly different environments long before Mid-Pleistocene Transition cranked up the difficulty. That makes the later bottleneck Even more puzzling, if our ancestors could colonize Georgia, China, even the tropical islands of Southeast Asia, why did global numbers crash so low? 1–2 million years ago. To get at that, we have to look at what Eurasia gives and what it takes away. Africa, for all its swings between wet and dry, sits mostly in the tropics and subtropics. Day length doesn't change that much through the year. Yes, you get rainy seasons and dry seasons, good years and bad years, but the annual cycle is relatively gentle. Move into mid-latitude Eurasia, and the game changes. Now you have summers that bake and winters that kill. You get half the year where days are short, plants shut down, insects vanish, and many animals migrate or hibernate. Food availability becomes strongly seasonal. Water freezes. Rivers that once were highways of movement become icy barriers. For a small group of hunter-gatherers, this amplifies risk in brutal ways. In the tropics, a bad few months can be deadly. In the north, a bad winter can wipe you out in a single season. If you misjudge the migration of herd animals, if your stored food molds, if an early frost kills the last berries and tubers you are counting on, there's no backup. You don't get to just walk a week south and find another green valley. Everything around you is equally locked into the same harsh rhythm. Seasonal extremes don't just reduce average resources, they tighten the margins for error. They also magnify the impact of randomness. In a world with strong winters, a slightly colder than average year can mean your main prey, in species, has a terrible breeding season. The next year, herd sizes crash. You, in turn, find much less food, right when you need to build fat and stores for the coming cold. A bad year for them becomes a catastrophic year for you. Now layer climate cycles on top of that. During the Mid-Pleistocene Transition, glacial cycles lengthen and intensify. Europe and northern Asia swing between environments that in warm phases can support forests and rich grasslands, and in cold phases look like frozen deserts. Ice sheets advance, sea levels fall, wind-blown dust covers huge areas, vegetation shrinks. Each of those major glacial advances slams small northern populations into a corner. Some groups retreat south, following forests and steppe belts as they contract. Others are hemmed in by mountains, ice, or sheer distance. Some just don't make it. Their valley becomes too cold. Their water sources freeze solid. The migratory routes they depended on are blocked by glaciers, and there is nowhere reachable to go. From a demographic perspective, Eurasia is a machine that generates local extinctions. Those early Homo erectus populations that pushed into Georgia, into northern China, into the Russian plains, they probably rose and fell in waves. A favorable interglacial, and they expand a harsh glacial, and their numbers plunge sometimes to 0 in a region. And there's another problem: isolation. In Africa, even in bad times, you can often imagine multiple pathways between refugia, mountain routes, coastal strips, lake chains, hard, dangerous routes, but at least some kind of network. In glacial Eurasia, entire regions become unpassable. Ice sheets block the north. Deserts expand in the interior. Steppe belts contract into disconnected patches. Forests fragment. A group living on one side of a mountain range or desert plateau might go tens of thousands of years without contact with anyone beyond their immediate neighbors, if they have neighbors at all. Low connectivity means that when a local Eurasian population crashes, it often crashes alone. There's no steady trickle of migrants from a big, robust core population to refill the gap. If the small band in this valley dies out from disease, or loses too many adults in a hunting accident, or simply has a string of bad reproductive years, that lineage is gone from that region. The tools they invented, the genes they carried, their unique solutions to winter and drought gone. Multiply that by hundreds of valleys, plateaus, and river basins over hundreds of thousands of years, and you get a Eurasian landscape full of what geneticists would call dead ends, lineages that never make it into our DNA because they blinked out before they could connect back to the main network. Then there's the coastal question. When we talk about hominins moving into Eurasia, we often imagine inland routes, the Levantine corridor, the Caucasus, the Central Asian steppe. But coastlines are powerful attractors. Shorelines offer stable, diverse resources, shellfish, fish, seaweed, seabirds, and often milder climates thanks to ocean buffering. For a clever omnivore, coasts are incredibly appealing, especially during periods when inland climates are swinging between extremes. Problem is, coastlines don't stay put. During glacial maxima, huge amounts of water are locked up in ice sheets. Sea level drops, in some cases by more than 100 meters. Wide coastal plains emerge where there is now open water. Rivers extend far out across what is today continental shelf. Bays become valleys. Islands join the mainland. Hominins almost certainly followed these newly exposed coastal corridors, settling along river mouths and estuaries that no longer exist. They may have formed dense little populations along these Ice Age shorelines, exploiting marine and estuarine resources. Then during interglacials, the ice melts, sea level rises, those plains drown. If your entire community is strung out along a low-lying coastal shelf, a few thousand years of rising seas can steadily push you back, fragment you, or even trap you on islands. Flooding can destroy key habitats, disrupt migration routes, and sever connections between coastal and inland groups. For populations already small and scattered, repeated sea-level seesaws are another way to slice networks apart. Coastal refugia appear during cold phases, supporting unique, perhaps relatively dense, populations. Then those landscapes are erased, literally underwater, taking their fossils with them. From our point of view, it's as if they never existed. Their only chance of leaving any trace in modern genomes is if some of their members manage to move inland and mix with other groups before the waves closed in. So when we ask, could the bottleneck have been global, we have to factor in this Eurasian chaos. One possibility is stark. Hominins in Eurasia simply don't make it through the worst phases of the Mid-Pleistocene Transition. Each glacial wipes out most northern populations. Interglacials allow temporary expansions, but the next harsh cycle cuts them back again. Over time, the only truly continuous lineage is in Africa, buffered by its latitude and refugia. In that scenario, the genetic bottleneck we see, the effective population of about 1,280,000, mostly reflects what was happening in a core African meta-population. Eurasian branches would be like experimental offshoots, sometimes thriving, sometimes vanishing, but never contributing much to the long-term genetic story that leads to us because they kept running into climatic brick walls. Another possibility is more braided. Maybe some Eurasian groups did survive the worst phases by clinging to their own refugia. Black Sea coasts, Caspian shores, south-facing mountain valleys in the Caucasus, pockets in India or Southeast Asia that stayed just wet enough. Their numbers would have been tiny. Their connections to each other and to Africa would have been rare, sporadic. In that case, the global hominin population might have been spread across Africa, Western Asia, and parts of Southern and Eastern Asia, but everywhere numbers were extremely low and connectivity was poor. The bottleneck would still be real, but not confined to a single continent. It would be a planetary thinning, with Africa perhaps acting as the main reservoir, and Eurasia, holding a few ancillary threads. The trouble is, from the standpoint of genetics, 900,000 years later, those two scenarios can blur together. If Eurasian populations were consistently small, frequently cut off, and often driven to local extinction before they could mix back with African groups, their long-term genetic impact would be minimal. The signal we see in modern genomes would still look like a tiny, highly constrained ancestry, whether those extra Eurasian lineages existed or not. Fossils don't make it easy either. Just like in Africa, the Eurasian record between about 900 and 700,000 years ago is patchy. Some regions show presence, others fall silent. Is that real absence or just gaps in our sampling? We don't know. What we can say is that Eurasia during the Mid-Pleistocene Transition was not a stable refuge. It was a harsh, pulsing frontier where hominin populations expanded when conditions allowed, then were pruned back again and again by ice, drought, isolation, and drowning coasts. If the final surviving lineages of our ancestors spent those 117,000 bottleneck years, mostly in Africa, Eurasia was still shaping their fate from a distance, removing alternative branches, erasing experiments, ensuring that only a very narrow slice of our broader hominin family ultimately fed into the lineage that would give rise to Neanderthals, Denisovans, and us. And Eurasia wasn't done throwing curveballs, because beyond the slow grind of ice and sea, another kind of catastrophe was stalking the Pleistocene, sudden violent events that could darken skies, poison landscapes, and crash ecosystems almost overnight. When those hit tiny, isolated populations, the results could be devastating. Imagine this. You're in a little band of early humans somewhere in East Africa, or maybe along a coastal plain that doesn't exist anymore. It's been a hard decade, but not the worst. You know the seasons. You know the winds. You know when the fruit ripens and when the herds pass through. And then one morning, the sun comes up. Wrong. The light is dim, reddish, like the world is being seen through smoke. Over the next few days, a fine grey dust starts to fall from the sky. It coats leaves, clogs streams, crunches underfoot when you walk. The air tastes bitter. Your eyes sting. The older people in your group have never seen anything like it. You haven't moved. The climate models haven't changed, but your local world has been flipped. This is what a big volcanic eruption can do. When a volcano blows its top in the right or wrong way, it doesn't just throw lava and rocks around the crater. It injects sulfur-rich gases and tiny droplets, aerosols, high into the stratosphere. Up there, those particles can spread around the entire planet, reflecting sunlight back into space. For a year or two, maybe more, the whole Earth is just a little bit darker and colder. We've seen this in recorded history. Tambora in 1815 gave us the year without a summer in 1816. Crop failures, famines, weird frosts in June. Pinatubo in 1991 knocked global temperatures down by about 0.5 degrees C for a couple of years, and those weren't even the largest eruptions our planet can produce. Scale that back into the Pleistocene and combine it with a climate system already on edge, and you get something we call a volcanic winter. Now, winter in this context doesn't necessarily mean snow everywhere. It means a short, sharp global cooling on top of whatever the background climate is doing. Shorter growing seasons, colder nights, changes in rainfall patterns, plants stressed, delayed, or failing outright. Animals that depend on those plants losing body condition, having fewer offspring, migrating differently, or dying in larger numbers. For a modern agricultural society, that's a crisis. For a tiny, scattered population of hunter-gatherers already living close to the edge, it can be existential. Think about the food chain from their perspective. You don't have granaries. You don't have global trade. Your food security is the web of plants and animals immediately around you, plus what you can store in bones, dried meat, maybe some roots cached in the ground or in rock shelters. A volcanic winter compresses that web. Grasses in your hunting grounds fail to seed properly. That hits the grazing animals, antelope, wild cattle, horses, whatever your region has. They emerge from the dry season weaker, more vulnerable to disease. Many don't make it through the next lean period. Herd sizes drop. The fruit trees you depend on don't produce at the usual time, or their crops are smaller and patchier. Edible tubers are less abundant because the plants above ground had a bad year. Insects are scarce. Birds time their migrations differently. Rivers with less vegetation, holding soil in place, clog with ash and silt. You, standing in the middle of all this, have two options: move or starve. But if the cooling and disruption are global, moving may not help much. The neighboring valley is dealing with the same failed grasses and sick animals. The group over the hill is hungry too. Now, remember, during the Mid-Pleistocene Transition, our ancestors aren't a thriving species, numbering in the millions. They're already battered by long glacial cycles, by droughts, by fragmented habitats. Global effective population size is trending down toward that 1,280 number. Drop a big eruption or a cluster of eruptions into that context, and the effects multiply. This is where volcanic winter becomes a serious suspect in the bottleneck story, not necessarily as the only killer, but as one of the big hammers in that evolutionary game of whack-a-mole. But there's a problem. Several, actually. We can find ancient eruptions in the geological record, thick ash layers, volcanic glass, chemical signatures that scream something huge happened here. We can even date many of them, sometimes with impressive precision. Matching those eruptions to population crashes over 1 million years ago is another matter. The farther back we go, the worse our clocks get. Radiometric dates on ash and layers often have error bars of tens of thousands of years, sometimes more. The genetic bottleneck we see around 930,000 years ago is also smeared over tens of thousands of years in either direction. Trying to line these up is like trying to synchronize two blurry photos taken with shaky cameras. You can say something bad happened in roughly this interval. You can say there were major eruptions in roughly this interval too. What you can't do, at least not yet, is point to a specific volcano and say with confidence, this one, on this date, knocked our ancestors down to 1,280 breeding individuals. Still, the circumstantial case is intriguing. The Pliocene was not quiet volcanically. East Africa, where many hominin lineages evolved, is riddled with large volcanic fields. The Mediterranean and Anatolia have active systems. Indonesia, Japan, the Philippines, Kamchatka, all sit on subduction zones that can produce truly colossal eruptions. We know that much later, around 74,000 years ago, the Toba supereruption in Sumatra blanketed huge portions of Asia in ash and likely cooled global temperatures for several years. For a while, some researchers argue that Toba caused a human population crash. Later, genetic work suggested our species probably weathered it better than that hypothesis assumed. But Toba is proof that enormous climate-shifting eruptions happen. If they happened once in the late Pliocene, they could have happened more than once in the Middlecene too. Here's where things get subtle. A single, truly colossal eruption A supervolcano event leaves a dramatic geological calling card. Thick regional ash layers, distinctive chemical fingerprints traceable across continents. You can spot it in marine sediment cores, ice cores if they're young enough, and lake beds. Multiple moderate to large eruptions spread over, say, 10,000 years look different. Each one might produce regional devastation and a few years of global cooling. Each one might wipe out local populations, crash regional ecosystems, and trigger migrations. But the ash layers might be thinner, patchier, easily eroded. Some fall into the ocean and disperse. Others are buried under later sediments. Their signals and global climate proxies get blurred with other noise, orbital cycles, background variability, dust from growing ice sheets. From the standpoint of a small band of humans on the ground, the difference between one apocalypse and three massive catastrophes scattered across their grandparents' people might not matter much. Both scenarios could keep pushing already fragile populations below sustainable levels. From our standpoint, 1,000,000 years later, they look very different in the record. A single super-eruption is like a neon sign in the rock layers. A cluster of big, but not absolutely monstrous eruptions is more like a string of burnt-out bulbs. You know, the lights were on at some point, but you can't see the pattern clearly. That's one reason volcanic winter stays in the plausible but unproven column for the 1.2 million year bottleneck. Another is geography. Volcanic impacts are not uniform. A huge eruption in Indonesia might hammer Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean rim with ash and local climate shifts, but have milder effects in West Africa. A massive East African eruption could be catastrophic for hominins in that region, while leaving far-flung groups relatively unscathed. If our bottleneck ancestors were mostly concentrated in certain refugia, say pockets of East African rift valleys, highland lakes, or coastal corridors, the impact of a given eruption depends entirely on where that refugia network was. And we don't know that. We're inferring it from scattered fossil sites, a handful of paleo-environmental records, and genetic models. There's a lot of room for error, so researchers are stuck juggling overlapping unknowns. Where exactly were the surviving hominin populations? Which volcanic systems were most active at the critical time? How strong were the climate effects of each eruption? Did they hit at particularly bad moments, during already harsh glacials, or right after a drought-driven crash? Depending on how you answer those, volcanoes can look like the main villain, a supporting actor, or background noise. One scenario is that a single giant eruption acted as a brutal final shove. Imagine populations already thinned by mid-person climate swings, sea level changes, and habitat fragmentation. Then a super-eruption happens in or near a key refugium. The immediate kill zone is huge. Ash collapses food chains. A few years of volcanic winter turn marginal areas uninhabitable. Hominin numbers plummet and never fully bounce back until the climate eventually improves. Another scenario is more insidious. No single eruption is planet-breaking, but every few thousand years, another big one goes off. Each event temporarily cools the climate and disrupts rainfall. Each one knocks growing populations back just when they've jork. But Hulsgoer Euromation, over 100,000 years, that series of blows keeps global effective population size low. Even if census numbers occasionally spike locally in that picture, volcanoes don't cause the bottleneck outright. They help sustain it, like a fever that keeps relapsing whenever the patient tries to get out of bed. Right now, we can't say which, if either, of those is true. What keeps volcanism on the table is not a smoking gun, but a pattern. We know eruptions can cause short-term climate shocks. We know small, scattered populations are hypersensitive to those shocks, and we know the timing broadly overlaps with a period of extraordinary demographic stress in our lineage. That's a convergence worth paying attention to, but it's also a reminder of how messy ancient history is. The more we learn, the less likely it seems that there was a single simple cause of the bottleneck. The planet was already hostile, ice sheets waxing and waning, sea levels swinging, habitats fragmenting. Into that chaos, you add sudden unpredictable environmental shocks, sky-darkening eruptions, ash-choked rivers, years where the rains just don't behave. For a species stretched thin, every one of those is another test, another round of whack-a-mole where a few more local populations disappear for good. And volcanoes weren't the only invisible knives in the dark, because even if you escaped the ash clouds, dodged the droughts, and found enough food to get through the lean years, there was something else waiting in every pool of standing water, on every carcass, in the breath of every stranger. Things you couldn't see at all, but that could finish a lineage just as efficiently as any supervolcano. You and I know what those invisible knives are: viruses, bacteria, parasites, fungi, a whole microscopic ecosystem that lives in, on, and around every animal on Earth. But if you try to trace their role 1,000,000 years into the past, you run into a problem very fast. Microbes don't fossilize neatly. They don't leave big skeletons in caves. They don't etch "I was here" into rock layers. And the diseases that matter most for population crashes are often the ones that leave the least obvious trace on bone. Archaeologists can sometimes spot signs of chronic infections in later human skeletons, things like tuberculosis, leprosy, syphilis, some parasitic worms. Those can scar bones, deform joints, leave distinctive lesions. But most fast-moving killers, the plagues that rip through a group in weeks or months and then vanish, they hit soft tissue and blood and lungs, and then those bodies rot away or get scavenged. After a few 100,000 years, you're left with nothing but normal-looking bones in a sediment layer. No written records, no cemetery with dates, no survivor diaries explaining half the camp died in the coughing sickness that winter. So when we talk about disease as a possible driver of the bottleneck around 930,000 years ago, we're in a strange position. We know disease had to be there. A world full of animals and water and soil is automatically a world full of pathogens. What we don't know is how often disease stepped out of the background and became a major evolutionary hammer. To even guess, we have to work from first principles. Start with the way those bottleneck humans were living. Small bands, probably a few dozen at most, spread across huge areas, mostly mobile, constantly interacting with their local environment, hunting, butchering, gathering, wading in streams, sleeping on the ground, sharing shelters with whatever else sheltered there before them. That lifestyle is a double-edged sword for disease. On one hand, they're exposed to everything. Every carcass they butcher might carry bacteria. Every scratch or cut can get infected. Every pool of stagnant water is a soup of parasites and microbes. On the other hand, their groups are tiny, and that matters. Many of the most terrifying diseases we know today, measles, smallpox, some influenza strains, are what epidemiologists call crowd diseases. They rely on a steady supply of new susceptible hosts. To keep going generation after generation, they need large, dense populations where people are constantly being born, growing up, and getting exposed. Measles, for example, can burn through a small, isolated village and kill a horrifying proportion of people. But once it's done, it's done. Everyone left is immune. The virus has nowhere else to go. It disappears until someone brings it back from a larger population center. Now, zoom back to the Pleistocene. There are no megacities, no towns, no trade caravans moving daily between hubs of tens or hundreds of thousands of people. There are scattered bands, maybe linked by long-distance kin networks, but with slow contact rates. You might encounter a neighboring group a few times a year, a far-flung group maybe once in a lifetime. That's bad news for classic crowd diseases. They can appear, wreak havoc, and then burn themselves out locally, with no place to persist. So, does that mean disease wasn't a big deal? Not at all. It just means we're probably not looking at one single Pleistocene plague marching around the globe for centuries. We're looking at something more insidious and uneven. First, think about zoonosis, diseases that jump from animals to humans. Anytime humans share space with animals, especially when we're hunting and butchering them, there's a chance for a pathogen to cross species. Rabies, Ebola, HIV, various influenzas, coronaviruses, all have animal origins in the modern world. Now imagine the Mid-Pleistocene Transition, when climate patterns are shifting, ecosystems are rearranging, and animal ranges are changing. Herds that used to be separated by geographic or climatic barriers start overlapping. New predators arrive in a region. Rodent populations boom, in some places crash in others. Bats move into caves that used to be dominated by different species. Every one of those range shifts is an opportunity for pathogens to explore new hosts. From the microbes' point of view, climate chaos is a networking event. Your small human band living in a refugium that had been relatively stable for generations suddenly finds new animal species passing through. Different bats in your sleeping cave. New rodents competing for your cached roots. Strange antelope or pigs migrating along newly opened corridors. You spear one of those animals, or you scavenge its carcass, or your child plays near the burrow, or someone gets bitten. Most of the time, nothing dramatic happens. The pathogen can't establish itself in human tissue, or it causes a minor local infection that the immune system clears. But occasionally, the fit is better. A virus or bacterium or parasite that's well adapted to living in, say, a bat or a pig, turns out to be just functional enough in humans to reproduce and spread. Suddenly, your band is dealing with something new. Maybe it's a hemorrhagic fever. Maybe it's a respiratory disease. Maybe it's a parasite that quietly wrecks people's nutrition over months. And remember, you don't have hospitals. You don't have antibiotics. You don't have germ theory. The only tools you have are your immune system, your cultural practices, and your social network. In a group of 20 or 30 people, that kind of zoonotic outbreak can be catastrophic. If it kills fast and spreads well, it can literally erase the band. Every adult who knows the hunting grounds, the water sources, the seasonal cues, gone. Maybe a few children survive by chance, adopted later by another group. Maybe no one does. Even a less spectacular pathogen can do massive damage by quietly shaving off survival odds. A long-term intestinal parasite that causes chronic diarrhea and malnutrition in a population where everyone already lives close to the edge can mean fewer babies carried to term, more infant deaths, slower growth, and weaker adults. Malaria, which today can be a slow, grinding killer rather than a marquee pandemic, is a good modern analogy. It rarely wipes out an entire population in a burst. It just makes everything worse, year after year, generation after generation. Now scale this up. Across Africa and Eurasia, during a time of repeated climate swings, hominin bands are following shifting resources, bumping into new animal communities, and occasionally into each other. Every contact is a chance to swap not just genes and tools, but microbes. Some pathogens die with a band that first acquired them. Others manage to hitch a ride, pass by a recovered but still infectious survivor who joins a neighboring group. A few might even survive in animal reservoirs and re-emerge into humans when conditions are right. From a distance of 900,000 years, that web of exchanges is invisible, but the logic is there. And here's where the bottleneck context matters. When global effective population size is already low, when your whole species is hovering around that 1,280 breeding individual mark, the margin for error is tiny. If there are millions of people on the planet, a disease that wipes out a few thousand here and there is a disaster, but not a species-level crisis. Populations recover. Variation is preserved. If there are only a few thousand scattered survivors total, losing even a few hundred in the wrong places at the wrong time can change the entire evolutionary trajectory. A disease doesn't have to be planet-spanning to have a deep impact. It just has to strike some of the wrong meta-opal nodes at critical moments. Hit a key refugium where conditions are actually good. Take out a cluster of especially well-connected bands, the ones that act as bridges between distant groups. Kill a generation of prime-age adults who would otherwise have moved, mated, and spread genes across the network. Suddenly, the web is thinner. Gaps that might have been temporary become permanent. A few promising lineages wink out. And because pathogens are opportunists, they don't show up alone. They pile on when bodies are already stressed. Think back to those volcanic winters and glacial pulses. Years when food is scarce, when people are undernourished, when children are weaned early because mothers can't produce enough milk, when long migrations are forced by collapsing habitats. Malnourished bodies have weaker immune responses. Wounded migrants are more vulnerable to infection. Crowded temporary camps, where multiple bands cluster near a shrinking waterhole, are perfect transmission environments. Disease in this context isn't an isolated cause. It's an amplifier. A drought by itself may not kill everyone, but it pushes people into closer quarters around the last reliable spring. That increases contact, which increases disease transmission. The disease kills those already weakened by hunger, leaving fewer to hunt, gather, or care for children. More kids die. Fewer women successfully give birth. Elderly knowledge keepers are lost. From the outside, looking only at the genes, all we see is effective population size dipping further. Was it drought? Was it disease? Was it both? The genome can't tell us the specific mechanism, only the demographic outcome. There's another twist. Because some diseases can't sustain themselves in tiny, scattered populations, there's a weird counterintuitive asymmetry. The very thing that makes a bottleneck population vulnerable to being wiped out by a local outbreak, its small size can also make it protected against the long-term establishment of large-scale, persistent epidemics. It's like living in a forest of matchsticks. A spark can burn down your little cluster of trees very easily, but the fire has trouble jumping very far because there just aren't that many trees in the first place. So, when scientists look at the bottleneck, disease sits in a kind of gray zone. It's hard to see directly in the record. Many classic human plagues probably couldn't have persisted given the small, scattered nature of early populations. And yet the ecological logic almost demands that pathogens were constantly probing, constantly exploiting moments of weakness, constantly helping to turn bad years into nightmare years. In that sense, disease is best seen not as the lone killer lurking in prehistory, but as a wild card in a stacked deck. Climate swings set the background pressure. Habitat fragmentation limits movement and mates. Volcanic winters throw sudden punches. Food shortages sap bodies and minds. And disease. Disease is the opportunist, slipping through every crack those other forces open, finishing off bands that might otherwise have clawed their way back. It didn't have to knock the global population all the way down to 1,280 on its own. It just had to make sure that whenever our ancestors tried to climb higher in numbers, there was always something ready to pull a few more of them back into the dark. But of course, even that wasn't the end of the story. Because when you live in a world where invisible killers can strike at any time, survival isn't just about avoiding the next infection. It's about what you eat, how you store it, and whether the landscape can actually support you when the sky darkens and the rain stop behaving. And in a world as unstable as the Mid-Pleistocene, even getting enough calories day after day, year after year was far from guaranteed. If disease is the opportunist slipping in through every crack, food is the crack itself. Because before plagues, before predators, before anything else, every single one of those 1,280 ancestors woke up each day with the same basic problem. Where are the calories going to come from? In a stable climate, that question has predictable answers. The river is always there. The roots are always ready to dig at the end of the dry season. The herds follow the same paths, generation after generation. Grandparents can point and say, when the leaves on that tree turn red, the animals will be here. The Mid-Pleistocene did its best to destroy that predictability. Glacial cycles got longer and harsher. Rain belts shifted back and forth. What had been forest might be grassland in a few thousand years, then scrub desert, then forest again. Lakes appeared and vanished. Rivers rooted themselves or dried up entirely. Now imagine you're a small band of early humans trying to make a living in that kind of world. Your entire survival strategy is built on 3 pillars: water, plants, and animals. Take away one, you're in trouble. Take away 2, you're in crisis. Knock out all 3 at once, even briefly, and you're looking at the kind of quiet, grinding catastrophe that never makes headlines in geology textbooks, but shows up very clearly in DNA as population collapse. Start with water. In a warming phase, glaciers melt, rainfall patterns change, and what used to be a reliable spring might get buried, diverted, or contaminated. In a cooling phase, ice locks up water in distant mountains, monsoons weaken, and rivers shrink into disconnected pools. If your local river goes from year-round flow to a string of muddy puddles, everything else follows. Plants that depended on consistent moisture wither or retreat to sheltered slopes. Animals that came to drink here move on or die, or change their migration routes. You can't just camp somewhere else immediately. You have a mental map of this land, not the next 200 kilometers away. For a few seasons, maybe you can adapt. Dig for water in old channels. Travel farther each day. Stretch your foraging radius. But now, add in plants. Many of the starchy roots and seeds humans rely on today are domesticated, the product of thousands of years of selective breeding. Your ancestors had the wild versions, smaller, tougher, often more toxic, and strongly tied to particular microclimates. A shift in temperature or rainfall doesn't just change how many plants grow, it can change which species are even possible in that region. The tuber that got your ban through last year's dry season, this year it barely comes up at all. The fruiting trees your grandmother counted on, they still leaf out, but they don't set much fruit because the insects that pollinated them shifted their own cycle in response to the climate. So you lean harder on meat. Except the animals are in trouble too. The mid-Pleistocene didn't just shuffle plant communities. It reshaped entire animal assemblages. This is the era when a lot of familiar megafauna, big herbivores and predators, start turning over. Some lineages go extinct regionally, others migrate. New species move in from elsewhere. If your people have spent generations learning how to hunt one particular kind of antelope or one kind of elephant, that knowledge is a technology. It's a collection of tricks, where the animals like to drink, how they react to being driven, where their tendons are strongest, how thick their hides are, which organs are safe to eat raw in an emergency. Now, picture that animal disappearing over just a few centuries. It doesn't have to go fully extinct. Maybe climate pushes it a few hundred kilometers away. In evolutionary time, that's a blink. In human time, that's the difference between grandparents who remember how to find it and children who never see one. In its place, a new kind of grazer or browser appears. Different habits, different herd structure, different flight distance when startled, different diseases in its blood and guts. There's no YouTube tutorial for this. No neighbor farming community to point and say, try that one. We've used it for generations. Someone in your band has to experiment, hunt one, butcher it, see what works. Maybe get sick from eating the wrong organ or undercooked meat. Learn the hard way. All of that takes time, energy, and trial and error in a world where failure can mean your kids don't eat. Dietary flexibility is a massive advantage here, and our lineage was already good at that. These people weren't strict specialists like pandas or koalas. They could hunt when the opportunity was right, scavenge when they found a carcass, gather plants, crack bones for marrow, smash skulls for brains. They likely did all of that. But there are hard limits to what flexibility can do when you don't yet have the later toolkits. No bows or arrows, no fish hooks, no pottery, no storage pits lined with ceramics, no agriculture to smooth out the bad years. You can scavenge, but you're competing with hyenas, lions, vultures, and other hominins. Reach a carcass late, and all that's left is skin, bone, and maybe a few scraps of gristle. You can hunt, but your weapons are handheld spears and sharp rocks. Big game is dangerous. A single bad charge from a wounded animal can take out your best hunter, the one who knows the subtle tracks and seasonal movements. You can gather, but your knowledge is local. You know which patch of roots tends to hold out longest in drought, which valley keeps a bit more moisture. When the climate shifts quickly, that ancestral knowledge suddenly points you at empty ground. So what happens when water is fragile? Plants are unreliable, and familiar prey is vanishing or moving away. You don't always see mass die-offs. You see something almost more dangerous: seasonal starvation. Maybe every dry season, food gets just a little tighter. Adult bodies slim down. People feel colder. Old injuries hurt more. Nursing mothers can't quite produce enough milk, so babies are weaned early on to whatever mashed roots or scraps of meat are available. In decent years, that's survivable. In a run of bad years, it's lethal. Infants don't make it through the hungry months. Toddlers get infections their bodies can't fight off. Pregnant women miscarry more often. Teenagers go through puberty later because their bodies are undernourished or they never fully catch up in growth. From the vantage point of a single campfire, it's sad but not necessarily dramatic. A few more little graves near the edge of the settlement, fewer children playing, couples who try for children but never succeed. Zoom out over centuries, and seasonal starvation quietly shapes the gene pool and the head count. Effective population size drops not just because of spectacular events, but because year after year, slightly fewer babies survive to have babies of their own. And food stress doesn't just act on bodies, it acts on relationships. When there's enough to go around, it's worth staying in touch with neighboring bands. You exchange mates, share stories, trade stone, maybe help each other during a bad hunt. When there's not enough, every extra mouth is a threat. Groups that might once have tolerated each other at the same waterhole now see rivals. A band arrives at a familiar foraging spot and finds another group already there, stripping the last edible plants. Tensions spike, fights break out. Someone is killed over a patch of tubers or a half-starved antelope. Even without open conflict, scarcity pulls people inward. Long-distance visits become rarer. It's too risky to travel far if you're not sure there will be food along the way. Bands split into smaller units to reduce pressure on local resources. A family that might have moved to join a distant group, spreading genes, knowledge, and social ties, instead hunkers down and hopes next year will be better. That's how subsistence stress can fragment a metapopulation without any dramatic war or plague. The bridges between groups quietly rot away. Every missed meeting, every aborted migration, every fight at a waterhole means fewer opportunities for gene flow, less sharing of innovations, more inbreeding in already small populations, and reproduction itself becomes a negotiation with scarcity. We know from modern hunter-gatherers that when food is plentiful, women can have children more frequently, bodies recover faster, pregnancies are more likely to be carried to term, breastfeeding is easier. When food is scarce over long stretches, everything slows down. Menstruation can stop. Ovulation gets erratic. The body decides quite sensibly that this is not a good time to invest in a 9-month pregnancy and years of nursing. You don't need anyone making a conscious decision to have fewer children. Biology does it automatically. Combine that with higher child mortality, later ages at first reproduction, and more deaths in childbirth due to weakened mothers, and you get a demographic trap. Not enough babies being born, and too many of those who are born failing to survive the lean years. From a genetic perspective, this looks exactly like a bottleneck. You don't have to imagine a single apocalypse, just a long grinding mismatch between what the land can provide and what our ancestors needed. Climate swings remove predictability. Megafauna turnover pulls away familiar prey. Limited technology caps how much you can squeeze from each patch of ground. Food shortages quietly raise the volume on every other risk. Disease, violence, accidents. And under that constant pressure, bands drift apart socially, even as they cling tighter internally, cutting the very networks that would have let them rebound. When scientists talk about the human population shrinking down toward 1,280 breeding individuals, this is one of the most plausible stories hiding behind that number. Not just an ice age, not just a volcano, not just a disease, but dinner or the lack of it. Deciding which children would see another winter, which bands would vanish without a trace, and which tiny clusters would scrape through long enough to matter. Of course, there was one more wild card in this survival game, because even in a world where water fails, plants vanish, and prey disappears over the horizon, humans have something no other animal quite matches: the ability to invent entirely new ways of getting food. And during the bottleneck, that might have been the only reason anyone survived at all. Imagine that same hungry world, but now add a different variable into the equation. Not rain, not grass, not antelope, fire. If you ask archaeologists when our ancestors first learned to control fire, you don't get one neat date, you get a range of May. There are hints of burned bones and heated stones going back more than 1,000,000 years at sites like Wonderwork Cave in South Africa and Geisha. Some researchers argue these are clear signs of campfires, repeated burning in the same spot at controlled temperatures, with patterns that don't look like random wildfires sweeping through. Others are more cautious. Could lightning have started those fires? Could wind have blown embers into sheltered spots? Are we reading intention into what might just be nature plus coincidence? So, you see numbers like 5 million years ago, 1,800,000, 400,000, depending on which criteria you accept for controlled fire. There's no consensus that fire was fully mastered exactly at the time of the bottleneck, but there's also no consensus that it wasn't. And that uncertainty opens up a fascinating possibility, because once you have reliable control of fire, everything about survival changes. Fire is not just warmth at night, it's light after sunset, which extends waking hours and lets people talk, plan, and teach when they're not actively hunting or foraging. Protection, because most big predators don't like walking into a ring of flame and glowing embers. Tool making, since heat can alter stone, harden wooden spear tips, and help process plant resins for glue. Cooking, which may be the biggest game changer of all. Cooked food is softer and easier to chew. It unlocks more calories from the same roots, the same meat, the same seeds. It kills some parasites and pathogens. It lets children, the sick, and the old get more energy from less food. In a world where seasonal starvation is stalking your band, the jump from raw to cooked calories is not just a comfort upgrade, it's a survival multiplier. A group with fire can squeeze more nutrition out of the same patch of land than a group without it. Now imagine that ability is not evenly distributed because technology never spreads smoothly in small scattered populations. It leaks, it stalls, it dies. In a world of fragile metapopulations, those patchwork networks of tiny bands dotted across Africa, fire might have been known to some people and completely absent from others. One valley learns to capture embers from a natural fire, feeds them with dry grass and twigs, then figures out how to keep coals smoldering through the night. A few 100 kilometers away, another valley never quite gets that trick to work. Every time lightning hits the savanna, flames roar through, then die, leaving only ash and memories. Now run a 117,000-year climate crisis on top of that. The bands that can maintain fire have options the others don't. They can roast tubers that would break teeth if eaten raw. They can detoxify some plants that would make you sick otherwise. They can boil questionable water if they figured out even simple water holding containers from skin, bark, or woven fibers lined with clay. They can smoke or lightly dry meat, stretching a big kill over more days, smoothing out the feast and famine pattern just a little bit. They can sit up after dark, telling stories about where the rains came from last time, what the stars looked like when the grasslands were greener, what their grandparents did when the river failed. That last part sounds poetic, but it's also hard survival infrastructure. Technology is not just things, it's knowledge, and how to nap that particular stone, which plants burn slow and smoky, and which burn hot and clear, how to handle a carcass so the marrow doesn't spoil, and knowledge is fragile. In a small band of 25 or 30 people, your library of skills is stored in a handful of brains. Lose 2 elders to disease or a hunting accident, and you haven't just lost beloved relatives. You may have lost your only expert fire tender, or the one person who could reliably find the right resin for glue, or the woman who knew which toxic beans could be eaten after 3 days of soaking and roasting. When populations are large and connected, losing a specialist is painful but not fatal. You can learn from another camp, marry into a group that still remembers the old techniques. Copy a tool design you see in a neighbor's hands. During a bottleneck, with groups already isolated by distance and by food stress, that redundancy disappears. Anthropologists talk about cultural bottlenecks, moments when not just genes, but ideas, practices, and skills get squeezed down to whatever a tiny remnant happens to preserve. The Mid-Pleistocene bottleneck might have been exactly that. Picture two neighboring metapopulations facing the same brutal climate swings. In one, some lucky or brilliant ancestors discovered how to reliably maintain fire and, crucially, how to pass that knowledge down. They wove it into ritual. You don't let the hearth go out. You teach children at a certain age. There are taboos around who can handle the embers. It's not just a trick, it's a tradition. In the other, maybe they discovered fire once in a while and then lost it. They never quite figured out how to keep coals alive during a week of rain. The one person who really understood it died before teaching it thoroughly. The band split in a bad year, and the subgroup that left didn't include the best firekeeper. A few extra dry seasons hit. Waterholes shrink. Plants fail. Animals move. Which of those metaopulse is more likely to survive long enough to show up in our DNA? Now extend that logic to tools and other technologies. This era sits in the transition from earlier, simpler stone industries to more sophisticated ones. Even if the full flowering of advanced tool traditions came later, the roots were already forming. More standardized flakes, more deliberate shaping, early versions of points and scrapers. A band that has learned to make even slightly better cutting tools can butcher an animal faster, with less waste. They can process hides more effectively, making better clothing or windbreaks. They can carve wood for digging sticks that reach deeper roots or expose hidden tubers. And none of that is guaranteed to persist. Complex tools require multi-step procedures. Find the right raw stone, hit it at the right angle, in the right sequence with the right hammer material. It's like a recipe. Recipes are easy to lose when there are only 2 or 3 people who know them, and no writing, no video, no permanent record beyond memory and muscle. Modern hunter-gatherer studies back this up. In very small, isolated groups, the technological repertoire tends to be simpler. Skills that require many parts, many steps, or intense practice are the first to disappear when population size drops. It's not that people get less intelligent, it's that there aren't enough minds and hands to maintain the full catalogue. The Mid-Pleistocene bottleneck could have worked the same way. As human numbers shrank, some regions may have slid backward technologically. Slightly more complex tool traditions could have broken down into crudder, easier-to-teach methods. Fire management could have become sporadic or disappeared in some lineages. Plant processing tricks might have been forgotten. That creates a dangerous feedback loop. Smaller populations lose complex skills. Losing those skills makes it harder to cope with environmental volatility. That leads to higher mortality and lower birth rates, which make population smaller still. Downward pressure all the way. But feedback loops can run in the other direction too. If even a few clusters of communities manage to preserve key innovations, steady fire, better cutting tools, maybe early forms of food sharing and storage rituals, those clusters would punch far above their numerical weight. They could buffer bad seasons more effectively, nurse more infants through lean times, help wounded hunters survive injuries that would have killed them in another band. They could maintain wider trade networks because they had slightly more surplus, slightly more security to risk long-distance travel. And through those trade and marriage networks, they could spread not just genes, but the very skills that were keeping them alive. You can imagine a sparse web of innovation hubs scattered across a continent in crisis. A few valleys where fire is never allowed to die. A few lakes, shores where people have worked out intricate fishing and trapping strategies. A few highlands where particular stone types are knapped into unusually effective tools. Bands that link into those hubs by exchanging mates, copying tools, sharing stories around joint campfires gain access to that cultural toolkit. Bands that are cut off from them slowly fall behind. In DNA terms, that looks like one thing. The lineages tied into that web become disproportionately represented in future generations. The others fade out. When we talk about the bottleneck leaving only about 1,280 effective breeding individuals, we might not be talking about a random sample of all the humans alive at the time. We might be talking about the descendants of the few communities that held on to fire, maintained the most robust tool traditions, and built the strongest networks for teaching those skills. The meta-population didn't just survive by luck. It might have survived because a tiny subset of it figured out how to preserve innovation when everything else was falling apart. And if that's true, then the bottleneck wasn't only a genetic filter, it was a cultural filter. It favored not just individuals with certain genes, but communities with certain habits. Teach your kids. Protect your knowledge. Keep the coals alive. Share with your neighbors when you can, because someday you'll need them. Of course, there's a twist. If our survival depended so heavily on a few fragile traditions preserved by a few fragile groups, then the line between making it through and blinking out entirely was thin, uncomfortably thin, which raises an unsettling question for scientists looking at that deep genetic scar today. Are we even reading it correctly? Or could that signal of 1,280 people be telling us something else entirely? When geneticists say it looks like humanity shrank to about 1,280 breeding individuals, there's an invisible asterisk hanging over that number because they're not actually counting skulls. They're reading patterns in DNA, and DNA has its own way of exaggerating some stories and flattening others. To understand how the signal might be misleading, we need to talk about something deceptively simple, where people were and who they were having children with. Picture 2. Extreme worlds. In the first world, there are 10,000 humans. They all live in one enormous, constantly mixing population. People choose partners from all over. Children move between bands, and over a few generations, genes swirl around like food coloring in a glass of water. In the second world, there are also 10,000 humans, but they're scattered in 400 tiny bands, each with 25 people. Mountains, deserts, and sheer distance separate them. Most people are born, live, and die within a narrow circle of a few dozen kilometers. Maybe once in a while, a teenager marries into a neighboring band, but that's about it. On paper, both worlds have the same census size, 10,000 living humans, but genetically, they don't look anything alike. In the first world, where everybody is mixing with everybody else, your genes see a big, well-shuffled deck of cards. Millions of shuffles per generation. Variation stays high, and genetic drift, random changes in gene frequencies, has a relatively small effect. In the second world, each little band is like a tiny card game happening at its own table. The deck at each table is small. Genes get reshuffled, but only among close cousins. Random chance matters a lot more. One accident, one disease, one bad hunting season can wipe out a whole local deck. Now imagine that every few hundred generations, a few cards from each table get together, mix, and form the deck that will be used for the next million years. Which world produces the genetic signal of a large, stable population, and which world produces the signal of a tiny one? Geneticists call this difference the gap between census size, how many bodies there actually were, and effective population size, how many breeding individuals your DNA behaves as if it remembers. The bottleneck number 1280 is an effective size, and effective size shrinks dramatically when populations are chopped into little pieces that don't mix very often. If the humans of 1.22 million years ago were spread across Africa in dozens or hundreds of semi-isolated groups, each group might have had its own local ups and downs. Some grew a bit, some crashed, some vanished completely. But the genes that ultimately made it through to us would have come from just a subset of those groups, the ones that happened by geography or luck or culture to keep sending their descendants into the future. From the perspective of our DNA, it doesn't matter if there were 5,000 or even 20,000 humans alive at that time, if only a narrow, poorly connected slice of them contributed to the genomes of people living today. The genetic clock sees that narrow slice, and it reports something like, "Looks like you all came from a surprisingly small breeding pool." That's population structure, and population structure can imitate a catastrophe. It can make a species look rarer, more squeezed than it really was in terms of raw head count. Now add another layer: gene flow. Gene flow is just the technical term for what happens when people from one group have children with people from another group. Genes flow between populations. If gene flow is common, the whole species stays genetically well mixed. Local quirks get smoothed out. A mutation in one corner of the range can slowly spread to the other corners, like gossip moving through a village. If gene flow is rare, if bands only swap partners once in a while, or if whole regions stay isolated for thousands of years, then each pocket of humans becomes its own little genetic experiment. Different gene combinations rise or fall in each place. Some combinations disappear forever when a local group goes extinct. From the point of view of someone reading genomes 800,000 years later, limited gene flow does something sneaky. It makes all the surviving lineages look like they passed through a very narrow, very recent tunnel. Because the lineages that didn't mix much, the ones that stayed stuck in their little valleys and never contributed to the broader gene pool, don't show up in modern DNA at all. They're ghosts with no descendants. Only the lineages that kept participating in long-term gene flow, even if only occasionally, leave a clear trace. And if that cooperation network was small, or if it fluctuated wildly, the effective population size plummets. So when we see that deep genetic dip around 1.22 million years ago, we might be seeing at least 3 different things layered on top of each other. Actual demographic crashes, real drops in the number of living humans, intense population structure, bands and regions barely talking to each other, and highly uneven gene flow. A few long-lived networks of groups contributing most of the genes that survive today, while others wink out and leave no trace. Throw one more complexity into the mix. This might not have been one single clean bottleneck. Our genetic methods are powerful, but they're not microscopes. They're more like seismographs. They pick up big shaking events in the past, but when you zoom way back, lots of smaller quakes can blur into what looks like one huge tremor. It's possible that what looks like a single 117,000-year bottleneck was actually a more complicated history. Repeated regional crashes as climate swung back and forth, bands colonizing new areas in brief good periods only to get cut off and die out when conditions turned again. Founder effects, where a tiny group splits off, survives in a refuge, and then expands, leaving a strong genetic stamp, not because it was the only group alive, but because it was the one that successfully recolonized a big territory afterward. Think of early humans moving into a temporarily lush corridor in North Africa, thriving for a few thousand years, then watching that corridor close as deserts return. Some groups get trapped and vanish. Others manage to retreat to safer regions. The survivors then reseed the empty lands when the climate swings back again. Each cycle like that shrinks and reshapes the genetic deck. Over hundreds of thousands of years, a series of overlapping founder events and local extinctions can carve a deep canyon in genetic diversity that, seen from our distance, resembles one long bottleneck. So yes, there might have been a brutal species-wide crash, or there might have been a long era of repeated near misses where survival kept depending on a few key refuges and a few well-connected networks. Our current models lean toward a real serious bottleneck. The signal is strong. It shows up in different methods with different assumptions. It lines up disturbingly well with the timing of the Mid-Pleistocene Transition. But we should be honest, the details are fuzzy, which raises the obvious question: how do we sharpen the picture? New ancient genomes would help enormously. Right now, our view of human genetic history before about 400,000 years ago is almost entirely inferred from living people's DNA, plus a few Neanderthal and Denisovan genomes that don't go back quite far enough to hit the start of the bottleneck. If we ever recover DNA from early Homo heidelbergensis or related species from bones securely, dated to around 1.2 million years ago or just after, that would be a revolution. Even partial sequences from a handful of individuals in different regions could tell us whether the bottleneck was global or patchy, whether some lineages bypassed it entirely, whether Africa, Europe, and Asia were all sinking and recovering in sync, or following different rhythms. Better fossils with better context would also change the game. Right now, that time slice is full of tantalizing hints. Scattered skull fragments, jaws, teeth, stone tools. But many finds are poorly dated, or their environmental context is incomplete. Improved dating techniques, more careful excavation, and new sites could reveal whether there really were long periods when human fossils almost vanish from certain regions, or whether our current gaps are just artifacts of where we've looked so far. And then there are the models themselves. As computing power grows and methods improve, geneticists are building increasingly sophisticated simulations, not just simple boom and bust curves, but complex landscapes with multiple populations, patchy habitats, varying migration rates, and realistic climate data layered in. Those models can test questions like, if we take a metapole scattered across Africa, subject it to mid-Pleistocene climate swings, let some regions wink out and others reconnect, do we get a genetic signal that looks like the one we see today, or do we actually need a true, species-wide collapse, down to something like 1,000 breeding individuals, to match the data? The answers to those questions are still being argued in papers and conferences, and that debate is healthy, because underneath all the technical detail, the real mystery hasn't gone away. Whether the signal reflects one catastrophic crash, many smaller crashes, or a long era of fragmentation and risky survival, something extraordinary happened to our lineage in that window. For more than 100,000 years, humanity, however we define that word for our ancestors back then, stopped being a slowly spreading, steadily diversifying success story and became something far more precarious, a scattered experiment, a species perched on the edge of what its environment, its technology, and its social systems could sustain. That's why scientists argue so intensely about how to read the bottleneck signal, because no matter how you slice it, it's pointing to a turning point, not just in our numbers, but in what kind of creature we were becoming. And that brings us back to the most unsettling part of the story. If our genes really did pass through that long, narrow tunnel, whether carved by a single disaster or by centuries of grinding attrition, what did that do to us? What changed in the humans who made it through, that didn't change in the ones who didn't? When any species gets squeezed through a bottleneck, evolution stops playing the same game. In a big, comfortable population, lots of different versions of genes can float around without ever being tested very hard. Random chance has plenty of room to play. Weakly harmful mutations can hide in the crowd. Weird, rare variants can drift along in a few families for thousands of years. But shrink that population, chop it up, and put it under intense stress for 100,000 years, and the rules change. Suddenly, every generation is a harsher filter. Genes that slightly increase survival chances in a bad year don't just help a bit. They become the difference between your lineage continuing and ending forever. Genes that slightly hurt you don't just lower your odds. They can vanish completely because one unlucky cold snap or drought wipes out the families that carry them. This is why bottlenecks matter so much. They don't just lower genetic diversity by accident. They sculpt it. They strip away big chunks of variation that might have been neutral or even mildly helpful in some other world. And they concentrate whatever works in this one brutal, unforgiving context. Now zoom back to 2 million years ago. Our ancestors are scattered. Climate is swinging hard. Habitats are splitting and shrinking. Food is unpredictable. Disease is probably a constant companion. Generation after generation, the same question keeps getting asked. Who survives this time? We don't know the exact answers, but we can guess the kind of traits that would keep coming up as winning tickets. Adaptability, the ability to shift diets when one staple disappears, to move camp when the water dries up, to learn a new hunting technique because the old prey animals are gone. Social cooperation, the bands that share food in a lean season survive when their more selfish neighbors starve. The groups that can maintain alliances, exchange mates, and support each other through a bad decade keep their genes in circulation. Resilience, not in the Instagram quote sense, but in the literal biological one. Stress responses that don't break the body. Immune systems that can handle new pathogens without collapsing. Brains that can function when sleep and calories are scarce. If the bottleneck was real and deep, those traits weren't just nice to have. They became the price of admission to the future. But there's a catch. We can't point to a specific gene, circle it in red, and say this came from the Mid-Pleistocene bottleneck and it made us adaptable. Evolution doesn't label its work. What we do see is that after this period, our lineage and the lineages that split from it into Neanderthals and Denisovans start showing a particular pattern. High flexibility, rapid cultural change, and a knack for turning harsh marginal environments into livable homes. Is that because of the bottleneck? Or did the same forces that caused the bottleneck also favor those traits in a more general way? Probably some of both. Consider adaptability first. Before this crisis, early humans already used tools and fire in limited ways. They already moved around with the climate. They weren't helpless, but a long grinding period of habitat loss and fragmentation doesn't reward good enough. It favors lineages that can pivot quickly when the rules change. Imagine two bands living on the edge of a shrinking lake. One band has a culture built around one main strategy, fishing a particular species that's been there for as long as anyone can remember. They're really good at it. When the fish population crashes, they're in trouble. The other band has a more mixed toolkit. They fish, but they also trap small mammals, dig for roots, and have a tradition of sending scouting parties farther out when things start to look bad. In a single good year, the specialists might do better. Across 1,000 chaotic years, the generalists win. If this kind of scenario plays out again and again across a continent, the genes and cultures linked to flexibility start to dominate the surviving pools. By the time the climate calms down, the descendants of those flexible bands aren't just random humans. They're humans with an inherited bias toward trying new things when the old ways stop working. Now layer on social cooperation. In a vast, well-watered world, full of game and roots, you can afford to be a bit more selfish. If your neighbors are jerks, you move a few valleys over their space. In a fragmented, unpredictable world, that strategy breaks down fast. You need friends beyond your little band. You need in-laws you can flee to if your valley turns to dust. You need trading partners who will swap obsidian for dried meat when one of you gets lucky and the other doesn't. Under those conditions, behaviors and norms that support long-distance cooperation have enormous payoffs. This doesn't mean our ancestors suddenly became saints. Violence, theft, and betrayal were absolutely part of their world. But the groups that could build and maintain wider social networks through marriage, exchanges, shared rituals, reciprocal gifts, even just reputation, would be the ones whose genes stitch together the future population. Seen from the outside, that looks like a species whose brain and culture are being tuned for complex social life, for keeping track of who owes what to whom, for punishing cheaters just enough to keep the game going, but not so much that you burn every bridge. Modern humans are extreme outliers in exactly this domain. We cooperate in huge anonymous societies held together by ideas, stories, and invisible rules. Neanderthals and Denisovans seem to have had their own versions of this on smaller scales. Did the bottleneck bend our evolution in that direction? Or did only those versions of Homo that happened to be more socially sophisticated make it through the Mid-Pleistocene gauntlet? From the fossils and the genetics, we can't separate those two possibilities cleanly. They may be the same story told from different angles. Then there's resilience. Chronic stress is usually bad for survival, but some organisms evolve ways to cope with it. A long era of near-constant environmental stress might have selected for nervous systems and hormonal responses that could handle repeated shocks without total breakdown. Individuals whose bodies stayed functional under hunger, cold, or fear would get a few more chances to reproduce than those who crumbled quickly. That doesn't mean our ancestors were calm. It might mean the opposite, a baseline of heightened vigilance that paid off in dangerous environments. Modern humans are again weird here. Our stress systems are powerful hair trigger and sometimes overreactive. The same biology that let our ancestors snap into action when a predator rustled the grass now gives us anxiety and office jobs. Is that a direct inheritance from bottleneck-era selection, or just a general feature of big-brained mammals trying to manage complex social lives? We don't know, but the timing is suggestive. A long period of living on the edge is exactly the sort of crucible that might wire a species for high sensitivity to threat and high capacity to endure it. All of this matters for what came next, because when the climate finally eased up and new habitats opened, these survivors weren't starting from zero. They were already carrying genetic toolkits shaped by tens of thousands of years of hard decisions. Be flexible or die. Cooperate or disappear. Endure or vanish. So when grasslands spread, when rivers returned, when corridors between regions reopened, they weren't just filling empty space with any old humans. They were filling it with the descendants of the most adaptable, most socially organized, most resilient humans the planet had yet produced. That's one way to understand why our lineage and our sister lineages didn't just drift back to some earlier, simpler state once conditions improved. Instead, they exploded into new niches. Some turned into Ice Age specialists. Some mastered high mountains. Others became tropical forest foragers and coastal foragers, and eventually open ocean sailors and farmers and city builders. The bottleneck wasn't just a dip in numbers. It was a reset in direction. But we have to be careful here. It's tempting to tell a neat story where one massive climate shock creates human intelligence, or cooperation, or language in a single transformative moment. Reality almost never works that way. The Mid-Pleistocene was already a time of shifting environments, spreading tool use, and changing brain shapes before the worst of the bottleneck hit. The forces that squeezed our numbers were the same forces that had been driving evolutionary experiments for hundreds of thousands of years. Volcanic winters, food shortages, new predators and pathogens, habitat corridors opening and closing like doors. The bottleneck is probably not a lone villain, but the most visible scar from a long series of overlapping injuries. Each drought, each regional extinction, each tiny founder group that stumbled into a refuge and survived, all of them chipped away at our ancestral variability and nudged our lineage toward a more flexible, more tightly worked way of being. From a distance of 1,000,000 years, that complex history collapses into a single line on a graph. Effective population size drops, then recovers. Up close, it's a mess of human stories we'll never fully know. Somewhere in that mess, a child who happened to be a little better at reading other people's moods got just enough extra help to make it to adulthood. Somewhere else, a band that had the cultural habit of sharing meat after a successful hunt, instead of letting hunters hoard it, survived one brutal winter that wiped out their more selfish neighbors. Some lines continued, others ended. If you're watching this, your own existence is proof that your particular thread made it through that tangled web. Every cell in your body is a descendant of that tiny set of survivors, which leaves us with a question that's more philosophical than scientific, but still grounded in this deep history. How much of what we think of as human nature, our creativity, our restlessness, our capacity for kindness and cruelty under pressure, was carved into us by that long flirtation with extinction? And if a species can come that close to disappearing and then reshape a planet 1,000,000 years later, what does that say about how fragile and how powerful survival at the edge can be? So, where does all of this leave the original question? Why did humanity, or at least our direct ancestors, shrink to the equivalent of about 1,280 C, breeding individuals, and stay there for over 100,000 years? After everything we've walked through, the honest answer is, we still don't know. Not in the clean, single-sentence way we might like. What we do have is a set of clues that all point in roughly the same direction. We have genetic evidence that screams severe prolonged bottleneck in that 900,000 to 800,000 year window. We have climate records showing the Mid-Pleistocene Transition turning Earth's ice ages into longer, harsher, more chaotic cycles. We have hints of drying corridors in Africa, broken migration routes in Eurasia, repeated volcanic punches, and the ever-present background noise of disease and food scarcity. Taken together, the picture looks less like one dramatic disaster and more like a grinding, overlapping series of pressures, a planet turning the screws in a dozen different ways at once. But between that big picture and the neat story our brains want to tell, there's a wide gap. The time windows are broad. The fossils are sparse. The DNA signal has been smeared and mixed by almost 1 million years of evolution. Since our population size graph is really a reconstruction of genetic variation, not a literal census, it tells us that something squeezed and reshaped our lineage. It doesn't tell us precisely who, where, or how. Was there a single super eruption that pushed an already stressed population over the edge? Did a new pathogen rip through small, isolated bands, sparing only a few lucky pockets? Did changing rainfall patterns simply erase most of the landscapes our ancestors depended on, until only scattered refugees remained? Right now, every scenario fits some of the evidence, and none of them fit all of it. And that's why the cause remains unresolved. The further back we go, the more our data turn from sharp photographs into blurry outlines. Radiometric dates come with error bars of tens of thousands of years. Climate records tell us that rainfall dropped, but not exactly what the local river looked like. Stone tools tell us someone was there, not how many of them survived the winter. Somewhere in that blur is the real sequence of events. We just don't have the resolution yet to see it clearly. So, for now, the bottleneck sits in our past, like a shadowy chapter, unmistakably there, clearly important, but only partially illuminated. 1 million years from now, if some future minds are reading the geological and genetic traces we've left behind, they'll probably argue about what really caused our own population crashes. Maybe they'll be just as frustrated with the gaps. In a way, that uncertainty is part of the story. Our species came out of a period where nothing was guaranteed, where even survival itself was a long series of risky guesses. It feels appropriate that when we look back, we're still piecing it together, still arguing, still imagining different versions of how it might have gone. So, I'm curious, given everything you've just heard, what's your theory? If you had to put your money on one main driver of that bottleneck, climate, volcanoes, disease, sheer bad luck, some combination, what would you pick and why? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and while you're there, tell me where you're listening from. One of the wildest things about this story is that people from every corner of the world can trace their ancestry back to the same tiny thread of survivors. It'll be amazing to see that global patchwork laid out below this video. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into the strangest close call in our evolutionary history, it really does help to tap like, leave a comment, and subscribe. It's a simple way to tell the algorithm that you want more long, slow journeys into deep time. And if you'd like to go even further down this rabbit hole, I've put together a whole book of prehistoric secrets, stories just like this, where the fossils and the genomes whisper half-remembered tales, and we try to reconstruct the rest. You can read more about it and grab your own copy at sleepytimehistory.com. 'Cause the bottleneck isn't just an old mystery, it's the prologue. Everything that comes next in human history, the rise of Neanderthals and Denisovans, the emergence of our own species, the peopling of the entire planet, is written by those 1,280,000 people who refused, against all odds, to vanish. We carry their legacy in our DNA, in our cultures, and in our questions. And as long as we're still asking why, their story isn't finished yet.